The ocean is not transparent. It never was. From the first attempts to measure it, the water resisted description. Sound bent, light vanished. Distance lost meaning. What could not be seen was declared empty, and what could not be measured was declared absent. Sonar was created to correct this assumption, to turn darkness into structure. It did not succeed completely. Sonar does not reveal what is underwater. It reveals what interacts with sound in expected ways. Anything that does not comply with those expectations occupies a blind interval, not invisible, but unrepresented. There are things in the ocean that do not reflect, emit, or disturb sound in ways that stabilize into tracks. They do not persist as echoes. They do not repeat as signatures. They do not behave like targets. They move. They exist. They do not appear. The concept of a predator is not biological here. It does not imply teeth, hunger, or pursuit. It implies asymmetry, one system capable of interacting with its environment while remaining undetected by another system designed to observe it. Predation, in this sense, is informational. The predator exists in the gap between signal and interpretation. Sonar assumes interaction. An object is present, sound encounters it, energy is returned or altered, and the alteration persists long enough to be recognized. This chain is fragile. Break any link, and presence collapses into noise or silence. There are volumes of water where sound behaves unpredictably. Thermoclines refract. Haloclines distort. Internal waves reshape paths dynamically. In such regions, echoes do not return cleanly. They scatter, split, recombine, cancel. A reflecting object can exist within these volumes and never generate a stable return, but this alone does not explain absence. There are also behaviors that defeat detection not by hiding, but by refusing persistence. Sonar requires repetition. It requires that evidence remain coherent across updates. A thing that changes its acoustic interaction faster than the system's cadence will never accumulate enough consistency to be believed. Detection fails not because nothing is there, but because nothing stays long enough to be accepted. The predator exploits time rather than space. It does not outrun sound. It outruns confirmation. Sonar systems are conservative. They are designed to distrust anomalies. A single unexplained return is ignored. 2 inconsistent returns are rejected. 3 contradictory returns are filtered as noise. Only behavior that conforms to expectation is promoted into reality. The predator never conforms. It does not reflect sound consistently. It does not emit identifiable noise. It does not repeat its interaction with the medium. Each encounter is singular. Each trace dissolves before association can occur. From the system's perspective, nothing happened. The water remains full of noise, biological, geological, mechanical. Against this background, absence is indistinguishable from irrelevance. The predator hides not by reducing signal, but by dissolving into variability. It is not silent. It is untrackable. There are recorded moments where sonar operators noted disturbances without contact, pressure fluctuations without bearing, Doppler shifts without source, shadowing effects where sound vanished locally without explanation. These events were cataloged as environmental artifacts. They were not wrong to do so. Sonar must choose stability over curiosity. A system that treats every anomaly as presence becomes unusable. It must assume that the ocean is chaotic and that most irregularities mean nothing. The predator relies on this assumption. It does not need to evade detection actively. It only needs to behave in ways that make detection inconvenient. It does not need stealth in the traditional sense. It needs incompatibility. The predator exists where models break. If it reflects sound, it does so briefly and at angles that change faster than beams can follow. If it moves, it does so across gradients that distort apparent position. If it displaces water, it does so within layers already unstable. Each interaction is real. None are admissible. There are zones where this advantage increases regions of strong stratification, high internal wave activity, complex bottom topography. In these zones, sonar already struggles to maintain coherence. The predator does not create confusion. It inhabits it. Confusion is camouflage. The ocean is filled with living things that do not need to be hidden because nothing is looking for them. The predator is different. It exists within a watched environment, but remains unseen because it does not satisfy the criteria of being seen. Sonar asks questions the predator never answers consistently. Where are you? How fast are you moving? What are you? The predator replies differently every time, not by deception, but by motion that invalidates the question itself. The system concludes, there is no answer. This absence is not alarming. It does not trigger warnings. It does not demand explanation. It is logged as nothing. Predation, in this context, is not an act of attack. It is an act of asymmetry. One system interacts with another without being reciprocally observed. The predator perceives. The sonar does not. Whether the predator is biological, mechanical, or something else entirely is irrelevant to the phenomenon. What matters is that it occupies a regime of behavior unrepresented by acoustic tracking. It does not need to be advanced. It does not need to be intelligent. It only needs to be incompatible. The ocean tolerates incompatibility easily. There are moments rare, brief, when fragments align. A pressure anomaly coincides with a transient echo. A shadow appears where none should exist. For an instant, the system hesitates. Then, the fragments diverge. Association fails. Continuity collapses. The moment passes. The predator remains unacknowledged. In reports, there is nothing to note. No contact, no loss, no evasion. Nothing occurred. This is the most effective form of concealment. Not absence of signal, absence of narrative. The predator does not appear on sonar because sonar does not describe everything that exists. It describes only what agrees to be described. The ocean contains more than that. And within it, something moves not faster than sound, not quieter than noise, but differently enough to remain outside belief. Sonar listens. The water carries sound. Something passes through both. Unrecorded. Absence, once accepted, becomes operational background. After enough cycles without confirmation, the system no longer expects presence in the region. Attention shifts elsewhere. Beams are reallocated. Processing weight moves toward signals that behave predictably. The water column where nothing is detected becomes, by definition, empty. Empty volumes are not monitored closely. This is where the predator persists. It does not occupy a single point. It does not maintain a stable depth. It does not move along paths that would allow accumulation of evidence. Its movement is discontinuous, not in space, but in interpretability. Every interaction with sound produces an outcome that can be explained away. Explained away is stronger than ignored. Ignored, anomalies linger. Explained, anomalies disappear. The predator benefits from explanation. A sudden attenuation of sound is attributed to layering. A transient reflection is attributed to surface scatter. A localized pressure fluctuation is attributed to turbulence. A Doppler-like shift without bearing is attributed to flow noise. Each attribution is reasonable. Each closes a question. The predator does not need to defeat sonar. It only needs sonar to defeat itself through correct procedure. Procedure favors the probable over the possible. Sonar systems are tuned statistically. They are built on models of how the ocean usually behaves and how objects usually interact with it. These models are refined constantly, validated repeatedly, trusted implicitly, Anything that violates them must either repeat or disappear. The predator ensures disappearance by variation, not randomness variation with structure too fleeting to stabilize. The difference matters. Random noise averages out. Structured behavior demands explanation. Fleeting structure collapses into ambiguity. Ambiguity is filtered. The predator's most effective trait is not silence, but inconsistency that remains within acceptable bounds. It never violates physics blatantly. It never produces impossible readings. It stays just inside the envelope of plausible environmental disturbance. It behaves like the ocean behaves, but only sometimes. Between interactions, it leaves no wake that sonar can follow. Hydrodynamic disturbances dissipate. Acoustic traces scatter. There is no persistence. Persistence is required for belief. There are theoretical countermeasures. Increase update rate. Widen acceptance gates. Lower confidence thresholds. Fuse additional sensors. Extend memory of anomalies. All of these are possible. All of them are dangerous. Lowering thresholds invites ghosts. Widening gates multiplies false tracks. Increasing update rates raises noise and self-interference. Extended memory biases interpretation. Sonar is designed to avoid these failures. The predator exists in the space created by that avoidance. It does not need to be faster than detection. It only needs to be faster than adaptation. Systems adapt cautiously. The predator exploits caution. In some datasets, analysts have noticed statistically improbable voids, regions where sound propagation behaves normally, yet expected background interactions are reduced, not absent reduced. As if something absorbs, redirects, or disrupts interaction without leaving a consistent signature. These observations do not survive aggregation. They lack repetition. They lack correlation. They lack outcome. Without outcome, they are downgraded. Predation without trace does not register as predation. The ocean is full of gradients: temperature, salinity, pressure. Within these gradients, energy behaves non-linearly. Small perturbations can produce disproportionate effects. The predator moves where these non-linearities are strongest. It is not hidden behind noise. It is hidden inside behavior. If it reflects sound, it does so where the return arrives via multiple paths and cancels. If it emits sound, it does so where ambient spectra already fluctuate. If it displaces water, it does so along shear layers already unstable. Every interaction dissolves into explanation. The system is correct every time it dismisses the evidence. The problem is not correctness. The problem is accumulation of correct dismissals describing a consistent absence. An absence that moves. Movement without detection is not paradoxical in water. It is expected for small things, slow things, soft things. What is unsettling is when the absence behaves with apparent intent, not biological intent, but directional persistence. A pattern that cannot be confirmed, yet does not vanish statistically. The predator does not chase. It does not pursue. It intersects. It crosses monitored volumes at oblique angles, briefly, irregularly. It never remains where beams linger. It does not circle. It does not hover. It passes through the geometry of observation without aligning with it. Alignment is everything. Sonar is strongest when target motion aligns with sampling. When it does not, motion exists mostly between updates. Between updates, there is no record. The predator lives there, between pings, between integration windows, between belief updates, between. This is not stealth as traditionally defined. There is no cloak, no absorption coding, no silence protocol implied here. This is behavioral invisibility, achieved by refusing to be statistically legible. The predator may not even be aware of sonar. Awareness is not required. Evolution, design, or coincidence can produce motion that evades representation naturally. The ocean has had millions of years to generate such behaviors. Sonar has had decades. The imbalance shows. The most disturbing aspect is not that the predator is unseen, but that the system is satisfied with not seeing it. Satisfaction is stability. Stability is valued. Nothing compels reevaluation. There is no alarm for what does not appear. There is only quiet water, full of sound, full of motion, and occasionally full of something that passes through without ever becoming real to the observer. Sonar listens. The predator moves. And between them, belief never forms. What remains most consistent is not the absence of detection, but the absence of urgency. Systems escalate when thresholds are crossed. They alert when confidence rises. They respond when continuity stabilizes. None of these conditions occur here. The predator does not trigger escalation because it never becomes a target. It never satisfies the minimum requirements for concern. Concern requires definition. Undefined phenomena are absorbed into background. The system's worldview remains intact because nothing contradicts it decisively. Every fragment of evidence that might suggest presence can be explained without invoking an object. The explanations are not improvised. They are pre-existing. They are correct often enough to be trusted. Trust is the predator's ally. There is a subtle hierarchy in sonar interpretation. Objects are favored over processes. Targets are favored over fields. Discrete causes are favored over distributed effects. This hierarchy is necessary for action. It also creates blind zones. The predator exists as a process rather than an object. It does not present edges that reflect reliably. It does not present periodicity that can be classified. It does not present inertia that can be tracked. It presents influence. Influence without localization is difficult to represent. It looks like environment. Environment is not pursued. In certain acoustic records, analysts have observed momentary increases in coherence across unrelated sensors, not enough to form a bearing, not enough to triangulate, but enough to suggest a common disturbance. These moments are brief. They vanish before correlation windows close. The data is discarded. Correlation requires time. The predator denies time. Time, for sonar, is segmented. Integration windows, ping cycles, update loops. Anything that does not persist across these segments does not exist operationally. The predator moves faster than segmentation, not in absolute speed, but in coherence duration. This distinction matters. A thing can be slow and still evade detection if it changes interaction rapidly. Conversely, a fast thing can be tracked if it behaves consistently. The predator chooses the former path, or arrives there naturally. Consistency is what sonar measures. There are theoretical ways to detect influence without objecthood. Long-term statistical anomalies, energy imbalance across volumes, persistent deviations from modeled noise. These approaches exist, but they are not prioritized. They do not produce tracks. They do not support decisions. They produce suspicion. Suspicion without localization is operationally useless. Thus, even when the predator's passage leaves a measurable trace, a slight redistribution of energy, a transient coherence anomaly, a localized attenuation, the trace decays before it can be acted upon. The system registers it, then releases it. Release is automatic. The predator does not need to evade multiple systems simultaneously. It only needs to evade the synthesis of systems. Data fusion assumes compatibility. It assumes that evidence from different sources can be aligned. The predator ensures misalignment. Each sensor sees something slightly different. Each processing chain interprets it differently. No consensus emerges. Without consensus, there is no object. The predator may be large or small. The narrative does not require scale. It may be singular or distributed. It may not even be discrete. These uncertainties persist because nothing forces resolution. Sonar is not designed to resolve what refuses to present itself as something. It resolves shapes, motions, signatures. It does not resolve absences that move. The ocean is full of absences, cavities, layers, gradients, voids of expectation. Most are static or random. This one is not. Movement gives it directionality. Directionality gives it advantage. Not advantage over prey, but advantage over observation. Observation depends on predictability. Even surprise must repeat to be recognized as surprise. The predator never repeats in the same way twice. This is not chaos. Chaos can be modeled statistically. This is conditional behavior. Always just inside explanation. The most effective camouflage is not invisibility, but normality. The predator appears normal because it appears environmental. Environmental phenomena are infinite. They absorb anomalies effortlessly. No sonar system can afford to treat the environment as hostile intent. It must assume neutrality. This assumption is foundational. The predator exploits foundation, not weakness. If sonar assumed intent everywhere, it would collapse under false positives. Therefore, it assumes intent almost nowhere. This is rational. This is also exploitable. The predator does not break rules. It inhabits them. It passes through monitored volumes without leaving a trail that can be reconstructed. It affects sound without reflecting it coherently. It alters propagation without anchoring that alteration to a point. It is present only in effects that do not accumulate. Accumulation is the enemy of concealment. The predator denies accumulation. As long as denial holds, nothing changes. No alert is issued. No report is escalated. No investigation is launched. The system continues listening for what it knows how to hear. The predator continues moving in a way that hearing cannot hold. Between them lies an ocean full of sound, and within that sound, something that never quite becomes anything at all. The most dangerous assumption is that absence implies insignificance. Sonar systems do not think in terms of predators. They think in terms of contacts. Contacts are defined by persistence, geometry, and repeatability. Anything that fails these criteria is downgraded automatically. Downgrading is not an error. It is how systems remain functional in complex environments. The predator remains functional by remaining downgraded. It never accumulates enough weight to be promoted. It never violates enough constraints to be escalated. It never stabilizes long enough to become a problem. It exists permanently below the threshold of concern. Thresholds are designed to protect against noise. They also protect the predator. There is a measurable phenomenon sometimes described indirectly in technical literature as negative space interaction. It refers to regions where expected acoustic behavior is subtly altered without an identifiable cause. Energy levels dip or redistribute. Phase coherence degrades locally. Beam patterns distort without mechanical explanation. These regions are transient. They move. They are never labeled as objects. Labeling requires edges. Edges require contrast. Contrast requires consistency. The predator leaves none of these intact. Instead, it produces gradients smooth, continuous changes that look environmental. Environmental changes are assumed to be non-agentive. They are not pursued. The system is correct to make this assumption most of the time. Predation does not need to be common to be effective. It only needs to be possible. The predator does not need to remain in any one place. It does not need territory. It does not need to linger. Its advantage is temporal. It intersects with observation briefly, then leaves before interpretation completes. Interpretation is slower than sensation. Sensors respond immediately. Processing responds after delay. Belief responds after confirmation. The predator exists between these stages. There are moments when the system almost resolves it. A brief alignment of returns suggests structure. A coherent spike hints at shape. A localized attenuation aligns too neatly with motion to be purely random. These moments do not last. The next update breaks the alignment. The next ping refracts differently. The next integration window averages the effect away. The system does not feel frustration. It has no internal state for that. It feels resolution anomaly handled, variance reduced, stability restored. Stability is always chosen over curiosity. Curiosity would require holding contradictory hypotheses open longer. That would consume resources. It would invite false narratives. It would degrade trust in outputs. Trust is non-negotiable. The predator relies on trust more than stealth. Trust that the environment explains itself. Trust that noise remains noise. Trust that absence is harmless. These trusts are justified statistically. They fail only rarely. Rare failure is acceptable. The predator exists in acceptable failure. There is no evidence that the predator intends to remain unseen. Intention is irrelevant. Behavior alone suffices. A thing that interacts with the ocean in ways that do not stabilize acoustically will remain unobserved regardless of motive. The ocean offers many such pathways. Soft bodies scatter sound poorly. Complex surfaces diffuse reflections. Distributed structures smear signatures. Rapid micro-adjustments break coherence. None of these violate physics. They exploit it. Physics allows invisibility without silence. Sonar, built to reveal objects, struggles with influences. It expects interaction to point back to a source. When influence does not collapse into source, interpretation fails. The predator is influence without anchor. It may affect current slightly. It may disturb layering subtly. It may alter sound speed locally. These effects propagate outward, detached from origin. By the time they are measured, the origin has moved. The system never sees cause and effect together. Cause without effect is invisible. Effect without cause is noise. The predator ensures separation. This separation does not trigger alarms. It does not demand redesign. It does not challenge doctrine. It is absorbed. Absorption is final. Once absorbed, the phenomenon ceases to exist operationally. It becomes part of the ocean's assumed complexity. It is no longer something that happens. It is something that is. The predator becomes indistinguishable from the medium. This is the deepest form of concealment. Not hiding within the environment, becoming indistinguishable from its behavior. Sonar listens for deviations. The predator behaves like variability. Variability is infinite. No system can chase it. Thus, the predator moves freely, not because it is unseen, but because it is never defined as something that should be seen. It does not break detection. It bypasses relevance. And as long as relevance remains the gatekeeper of attention, the predator remains where it has always been, underwater, present, moving, and absent from sonar. What cannot be categorized cannot be confronted. Sonar systems are built to resolve uncertainty into classes: contact or no contact, object or environment, track or noise. These binaries are not philosophical choices. They are operational necessities. Action requires decision, and decision requires categories. The predator never enters a category. It does not linger long enough to be promoted from anomaly. It does not repeat consistently enough to be modeled as environment. It does not stabilize enough to be treated as a process. It occupies the interval before classification. This interval is brief. It is not designed to persist. Classification systems assume that everything meaningful will eventually declare itself through repetition. Meaning is equated with persistence. What does not persist is treated as irrelevant. The predator violates this assumption without violating behavior. Its presence is episodic but directional. Its effects are transient but correlated. Its interaction is minimal but sufficient. Correlation without persistence is invisible. In some acoustic data sets, subtle asymmetries appear when averaged incorrectly. Not strong enough to flag, not stable enough to isolate. Slight biases in phase alignment. Small but repeatable shifts in energy distribution that vanish when data is segmented differently. Segmentation erases it. Segmentation is mandatory. Without segmentation, data volumes become unmanageable. Without manageability, systems fail. The predator benefits from what systems require to survive. It does not need to evade all forms of sensing. It only needs to evade the dominant one. Sonar dominates underwater perception because it scales. Optical systems do not. Chemical sensing is slow. Pressure sensing is local. Sonar is global enough to matter. The predator does not challenge sonar directly. It sidesteps its strengths. Sonar is strongest at detecting edges, contrasts, and periodicity. The predator avoids edges by diffusing interaction. It avoids contrast by blending with gradients. It avoids periodicity by refusing repetition. It is not quiet. It is not still. It is not small. It is uncooperative. Uncooperative phenomena are common in nature. Most are benign. Some are not. Sonar cannot distinguish between the two without accumulation of evidence. The predator denies accumulation. There is no need for concealment protocols. No adaptive countermeasures are implied here. The predator does not react to sonar. Reaction would imply awareness. Awareness is unnecessary. The ocean already provides everything needed. Sound bends unpredictably. Layers shift constantly. Energy disperses unevenly. The predator moves within this instability, like a shape drawn in water, momentarily visible, then gone, leaving no edge to follow. Edge detection fails. Without edges, there is no object. Without object, there is no concern. Concern is expensive. Concern leads to investigation. Investigation leads to false positives. False positives undermine trust. Trust is preserved by restraint. The predator exists because restraint exists. In environments where restraint is relaxed during experimental runs, anomaly hunts, exploratory surveys, fleeting hints appear more often. Analysts see patterns that do not repeat. They note disturbances that seem intentional but cannot be justified. These notes do not survive review. They lack rigor. They lack confirmation. They lack consequence. Consequence is the final arbiter of reality. The predator leaves none. If it affected operations directly, attention would follow. If it caused measurable disruption, interest would rise. If it produced outcomes, scrutiny would intensify. It does none of these things overtly. Predation, again, is informational. It may observe without being observed. It may pass through without being tracked. It may influence without being localized. The system has no variable for that. The predator's greatest advantage is patience. Not temporal patience, but structural patience. It does not force recognition. It does not demand response. It remains compatible with dismissal. Dismissal is stable. Over time, the possibility of such a predator becomes unthinkable, not because it is disproven, but because it is unneeded. Systems do not account for what they do not need to explain. The ocean does not require explanation. Sonar requires coherence. Between them lies a class of phenomena that neither insists on explanation nor submits to coherence. The predator belongs there. It is not hidden in darkness. It is hidden in procedure. It does not defeat sonar. It completes it. Sonar listens for what can be followed. The predator moves so that following never begins. And in the continuous noise of the sea, that is enough. There is no moment of discovery. There is no first contact, no initial detection that later becomes disputed. The predator is never there in the way sonar understands presence. It enters the system already dissolved into process. By the time sound interacts with it, the interaction has already been stripped of identity. This is why it is never searched for. Search requires a hypothesis. Hypotheses require prior indication. Prior indication requires evidence that survives long enough to be remembered. The predator leaves no such evidence. It leaves effects that expire before memory engages. Memory is selective by necessity. Sonar systems retain what can be compared. What cannot be compared is overwritten. Buffers roll. Windows close. Context is lost. The predator relies on this amnesia, not forgetting, overwriting. The difference matters. Forgetting implies something once existed clearly. Overwriting implies it never achieved clarity at all. The predator never becomes clear. There is a persistent misconception that invisibility requires suppression, absorption of sound, cancellation of echo, reduction of noise. These are technical solutions to a technical problem. The predator operates at a different level. It does not suppress sound. It allows sound to behave normally. Normal behavior is the most effective concealment. Sound scatters, refracts, interferes. The predator ensures that every interaction with it looks like one of these expected outcomes. It does not create anomalies large enough to demand explanation. It creates micro-deviations small enough to be averaged away. Averaging is fatal to singularity. Singularity is required for recognition. The predator does not appear as a point, a surface, or a volume. It appears, briefly, as a statistical bias that disappears when statistics are applied correctly. Correct application of statistics destroys it. Correctness eliminates it every time. This is why no corrective measure exists. If sonar were tuned to capture such biases, it would fail catastrophically elsewhere. It would hallucinate predators everywhere. It would lose its ability to discriminate. Discrimination is more valuable than completeness. The predator thrives on this valuation. There is no adversarial loop here. Sonar does not adapt because nothing is perceived as adapting against it. The predator does not respond because it does not need to. The interaction is asymmetrical and static. Static asymmetry is invisible. If the predator were to remain in one place, patterns would accumulate. If it were to move regularly, periodicity would emerge. If it were to grow louder, amplitude would betray it. It does none of these. It passes through. Passing through leaves no footprint in systems that require persistence to care. Even in retrospective analysis, reconstruction fails. Analysts can replay data endlessly and still not isolate a cause. Every attempt to draw a line through anomalies fails because the anomalies refuse to align. The moment alignment is imposed, explanation collapses. The conclusion is always the same: environment, noise, artifact. These are not excuses. They are accurate descriptions of the data. The predator is not misclassified. It is unclassifiable. Classification systems do not flag their own blind spots. They assume completeness within defined bounds. Anything outside those bounds does not exist operationally. Operational existence is the only existence that matters to the system. The predator exists elsewhere. It may traverse monitored areas repeatedly without ever being counted. It may pass near sensors without ever triggering alarms. It may influence sound fields subtly enough to alter detection probabilities for other objects without being detected itself. These secondary effects are never traced back. Causality requires anchors. The predator leaves none. What remains is a quiet confidence that nothing unusual occurred. That confidence is not false. Nothing unusual occurred within the system's definition of unusual. Definitions protect systems. The ocean, again, is indifferent. It supports objects, processes, and interactions far richer than sonar can represent. Sonar samples a thin slice of this richness and calls it reality. The predator lives outside the slice, not above it, not below it. Outside its dimensional assumptions. It is not a ghost. It is not mythical. It is a consequence of how perception is structured. As long as sonar relies on persistence, coherence, and repeatability, there will be motion that bypasses it. As long as systems privilege stability over curiosity, there will be things that move freely through their blind intervals. The predator does not need to be hunted. It does not need to be defeated. It exists because observation has limits, and those limits are not failures. They are design. Sonar listens within those limits. The water carries sound beyond them, and something moves there, not hidden, not silent, but incompatible enough to never appear at all. Invisibility, when sustained long enough, reshapes expectation. Sonar systems are calibrated not only by physics but by history. What has not appeared before is unlikely to be anticipated now. What has appeared repeatedly defines the bounds of preparation. The predator exists outside this historical reinforcement. It does not accumulate precedent. Without precedent, there is no anticipation. Anticipation governs attention. Attention governs resolution. Resolution governs belief. The predator never enters this chain. Its interactions with sound are always local in time and diffuse in space. They do not produce a signature that can be cached. They do not generate a pattern that can be stored. Each interaction is resolved immediately as environment and then discarded. Discarding is automatic. The system is designed to forget correctly. Forgetting is not loss of data. It is loss of relevance. Data without relevance is noise. Noise is filtered. Filtering restores clarity. Clarity is not completeness. The predator relies on clarity's preference for simplicity. There are volumes of water where sonar performance is known to degrade. These volumes are charted, modeled, expected. When detection probability drops, it is attributed to these factors. The predator passes through such volumes preferentially, not because they are hiding places, but because they are explanations already in place. Pre-existing explanations are powerful shields. A system that already knows why it cannot see does not ask what it cannot see. The predator does not create new blind spots. It inhabits known ones dynamically. It moves with the instability of the medium itself. It is present where sound is least cooperative and gone before cooperation returns. Timing is essential, not speed timing. The predator does not need to move quickly. It needs to arrive when the system is least capable of coherence. It needs to leave before coherence recovers. This window is small but recurring. Internal waves pass. Layers realign. Currents shear. During these transitions, sonar confidence dips briefly. Thresholds adapt. Models recalibrate. The predator intersects precisely here. It is never present when the system is confident. It is never absent when the system is uncertain. This alignment does not require intelligence. It emerges naturally when motion couples to the same environmental dynamics that destabilize sound propagation. The ocean provides the schedule. Because the predator's presence coincides with uncertainty, it is dismissed with confidence. The system trusts its own assessment that nothing reliable can be seen at that moment. This trust is correct in isolation. It is misleading in aggregate. Aggregate perception would reveal a pattern. The system does not aggregate uncertainty. Uncertainty is not cumulative. Certainty is. Only certainty leaves records. The predator leaves none. Over long periods, the system's picture of the underwater domain becomes increasingly smooth. Gaps exist, but they are static in representation. Dynamic absences are flattened into background variability. This flattening hides motion. Motion without record becomes indistinguishable from non-existence. The predator, therefore, becomes not just unseen, but unthinkable. Its possibility is excluded not by evidence, but by absence of need. The system functions without invoking it. Therefore, invoking it would only complicate. Complication is avoided. The predator does not threaten the system's mission directly. It does not disrupt operations overtly. It does not interfere measurably with detection of known targets. It does not demand response. This lack of demand is its greatest protection. Systems evolve in response to pressure. Without pressure, no adaptation occurs. The predator applies none. It remains orthogonal. There is an important distinction here. The predator is not optimized against sonar. It is optimized against representation. It exists in a regime where representation is optional and therefore often omitted. Representation requires payoff. The predator offers none. Even if its passage coincides with other detections, attribution fails. Effects are distributed. Causes are unanchored. The system cannot assign credit or blame. Without attribution, nothing is learned. Learning requires feedback. The predator provides no feedback loop. It does not react. It does not escalate. It does not repeat in a way that reinforces memory. Memory fades. What remains is a stable operational picture, calm, coherent, incomplete. The ocean remains layered, dynamic, excessive. Within it, something continues to move in ways that never coalesce into tracks, never generate alerts, never appear on screens. Not because it is perfectly hidden, because it is never required to exist. Sonar listens for what demands attention. The predator never does. And so it continues present, moving, interacting, and absent by every measure that matters. Eventually, invisibility stops being a condition and becomes an assumption. Once the system has operated long enough without contradiction, its internal models settle into equilibrium. They no longer actively test their own limits. They apply them. What lies beyond those limits is not contested. It is excluded preemptively. This exclusion is efficient. Sonar does not waste effort attempting to resolve what historically has not resolved. It allocates time, power, and attention where return is expected. Expectation is shaped by experience. Experience, in turn, is shaped by what survives interpretation. The predator never survives interpretation. It enters perception briefly, then exits before meaning can attach. Over time, such brief entries cease to be noted at all. Thresholds adapt subtly. Filters become slightly more aggressive. Marginal events are removed earlier in the chain. No parameter is explicitly changed. Behavior changes anyway. This is how systems harden. The predator benefits from hardening. Hard boundaries are easier to avoid than soft ones. Soft boundaries invite exploration. Hard boundaries repel attention. Attention is the only true detector. Without attention, even strong signals fade. There is no moment when the system decides not to look for the predator. It simply never looks for what has never been found. Search space is defined by possibility, and possibility is defined by precedent. No precedent exists. In this state, even deliberate attempts to detect such a presence would struggle. Experiments would require redefining success, tolerating ambiguity, and accepting incomplete explanations. These conditions are incompatible with routine operation. Routine operation dominates. The predator does not disrupt routine, it passes through it. In certain environments, especially those with complex layering and persistent internal motion, the predator's passage may coincide with subtle reductions in sonar effectiveness against other objects. Detection ranges shorten, confidence dips briefly. These effects are attributed to environment. The attribution is correct. The predator is part of the environment as far as sonar is concerned. This is the final concealment, not being hidden by the environment, but being included within it conceptually. Once included, there is no longer a reason to isolate. Isolation requires contrast. The predator avoids contrast by distributing its influence across multiple variables simultaneously. No single metric spikes. No threshold is crossed decisively. Everything shifts a little, then returns. Small shifts are ignored. Ignored shifts accumulate only outside the system in reality, not in record. The system's record remains clean. Clean records reinforce trust. Trust discourages doubt. Doubt is the precursor to discovery. Discovery does not occur. The predator does not need discovery. It does not seek acknowledgement. Its existence does not depend on being named or recognized. It moves through the medium as a consequence of its properties, not as a response to observation. Observation is optional. This is what distinguishes it from conventional threats or entities. Those require interaction. This requires only coexistence. The ocean accommodates both. Sonar continues to operate within its design envelope. Within that envelope, it performs exceptionally. It detects, tracks, classifies, and resolves countless objects accurately. Outside the envelope, it remains silent, not because there is nothing, but because silence is preferable to uncertainty. The predator exists entirely in that preference. As long as systems value stability over completeness, there will be regions of reality that never enter representation. As long as representation governs action, those regions will remain operationally irrelevant. Irrelevance is the ultimate invisibility. The predator is not invisible because it cannot be seen. It is invisible because seeing it would change nothing. No response would follow. No decision would be altered. No action would be justified. Without consequence, perception is unnecessary. Thus, the predator remains unacknowledged, not by failure, but by sufficiency. The system is sufficient without it. The ocean remains sufficient without explanation. Between sufficiency and excess, something continues to move, interacting with sound, bending it slightly, never enough to insist, never enough to repeat. Sonar listens for insistence. The predator never insists. And so it remains underwater, present, moving, and permanently absent from sonar. At some point, absence becomes infrastructure. The system no longer treats unseen regions as unknown. It treats them as resolved by default. Resolution does not require evidence when precedent is strong enough. Precedent here is not proof of emptiness, but proof of irrelevance. What has never mattered is assumed never to matter. This assumption stabilizes everything downstream. Maps are drawn with confidence gaps. Coverage models include attenuation zones. Detection probabilities are annotated, averaged, and accepted. These regions are not feared. They are managed. Management replaces curiosity. The predator moves through managed space. It does not need to adapt to sonar upgrades. Increased sensitivity only increases data volume, not interpretive freedom. More data tightens filters. Tighter filters exclude faster. The predator benefits from refinement. Refinement sharpens blindness. As systems improve, they grow less tolerant of ambiguity. Ambiguity is expensive at scale. High-resolution sensors produce overwhelming complexity, unless interpretation is constrained aggressively. Those constraints eliminate edge cases first. The predator is an edge case that never stabilizes into a case. It is never repeated cleanly enough to justify exception handling. It is never dramatic enough to force redesign. It exists below redesign pressure. Pressure drives evolution. The predator applies none. There is no feedback loop that would force the system to acknowledge it. Feedback requires consequence. Consequence requires persistence. Persistence requires legibility. The predator denies legibility. In doing so, it reveals a deeper truth about sensing systems. They do not discover reality. They negotiate with it. They agree on what counts. Everything else is left unspoken. The predator exists in what is left unspoken. This is not an oversight. It is the cost of operability. A system that attempts to represent everything represents nothing well. Sonar survives by refusing representation where representation would destabilize. Destabilization is worse than ignorance. Thus, the predator becomes a structural non-event. It is not missed. It is not overlooked. It is structurally excluded. Even hypothetical discussion struggles to frame it. Without tracks, without detections, without repeatable signatures, the concept resists formalization. It becomes speculative. Speculation is not operational. Operational frameworks do not accommodate speculation. The predator, therefore, never enters doctrine. Doctrine shapes training. Training shapes perception. Perception shapes what is noticed. The loop closes. The predator may pass through critical areas without altering readiness. It may traverse zones of strategic interest without being flagged. It may exist alongside known objects without interacting in a way that forces acknowledgement. It does not compete for attention. Attention is scarce. Sonar allocates attention to what can be resolved. The unresolved is backgrounded. Over time, background becomes invisible. This invisibility is not darkness. It is normalization. The predator is normalized absence in motion. If it were removed entirely, nothing would change. If it were present in greater numbers, still nothing would change unless thresholds were crossed. It remains below those thresholds by nature or by coincidence. Coincidence is sufficient. The ocean is large enough to sustain coincidence indefinitely. Thus, the predator persists not as a threat, not as a mystery, but as a reminder of limits that are never reached because reaching them is unnecessary. The system functions. The mission proceeds. The record remains clean. Cleanliness is deceptive, not because it hides danger, but because it hides incompleteness. Incompleteness, when stable, becomes invisible. The predator inhabits that invisibility perfectly. It does not hide from sonar. It does not evade detection. It does not resist classification. It never arrives at the point where any of that would apply. It exists before relevance and after dismissal. Sonar listens within relevance. The ocean moves beyond it. And somewhere in that excess between what must be known and what can be ignored, motion continues, unchallenged, untracked, and unrequired to ever appear. There is no threshold where the system admits ignorance. Ignorance is not an operational state. Systems do not say unknown unless unknown has been predefined as a category. What has not been predefined cannot be selected. It is bypassed. The predator benefits from bypass. Bypassing is quieter than rejection. Rejection leaves a trace. Bypassing leaves nothing. No alert, no log entry, no reason code. The system never acknowledges the event strongly enough to need explanation. This is why the predator is never reviewed. Reviews require artifacts. Artifacts require commitment. Commitment requires belief. The predator never generates belief. Belief is expensive. It consumes memory. It demands reconciliation. It propagates uncertainty. The predator does not provoke belief. It provokes normalization. Normalization is cheaper. There are moments when system designers account for unknown unknowns. These acknowledgments appear in margins, in caveats, in abstract risk language. They are not actionable. They do not translate into detection logic. They do not affect processing pipelines. They remain conceptual. The predator exists beyond concept. If it were to be modeled, the model would need to allow for entities that do not resolve into entities, influences that do not collapse into sources motion, that does not generate continuity. Such models are mathematically possible. They are operationally useless. Uselessness is exclusion. Sonar exists to reduce uncertainty enough to act. It does not exist to catalog everything that happens. Action defines relevance. Relevance defines reality. The predator never triggers action. Even if its presence subtly alters acoustic conditions, the alteration remains within tolerances. Tolerances are designed to absorb variability without response. Variability is assumed to be natural unless proven otherwise. Proof requires persistence. Persistence never arrives. The predator's path through the water column is therefore never reconstructed. There is no before and after. There is no trajectory. There is only a sequence of normal readings, punctuated by nothing notable. Nothing notable is the most powerful camouflage. Camouflage that requires effort can fail. Camouflage that is identical to background cannot. The predator does not reduce its acoustic footprint. It dissolves it. Dissolution occurs when interaction is distributed across too many degrees of freedom to be summarized. Sonar summarizes aggressively. Anything that resists summarization is lost. Loss here is not failure. It is outcome. The ocean offers infinite degrees of freedom. Sound interacts with them continuously. Most of these interactions are uninteresting. The predator ensures its interactions remain in that majority. Majority behavior is invisible. If the predator were to slow, if it were to linger, if it were to repeat, it would become visible. Visibility is dangerous. It would invite classification. Classification would invite attention. Attention would change the relationship. The predator avoids change. It does not optimize for evasion. It optimizes for continuity of irrelevance. Irrelevance is stable. There is a final asymmetry worth noting. Sonar systems are audited for what they detect, not for what they do not. Performance is measured in hits, tracks, classifications. Absence does not appear on dashboards. Dashboards shape confidence. Confidence discourages doubt. The predator thrives in confidence. This is not a story of technological failure. It is a story of technological sufficiency. Sonar is sufficient for its purpose. That purpose does not include total representation of the underwater world. Total representation is impossible. The predator exists because impossibility exists. As long as sensing systems must choose, they will choose coherence over completeness. As long as they choose coherence, there will be motion that passes unacknowledged. The predator is that motion, not hidden, not silent, not fast enough to outrun sound, simply aligned with the limits of belief. Sonar listens where belief can form. Beyond that, the water carries sound, motion unfolds, interactions occur, and something moves through all of it, never becoming necessary to see. What cannot be falsified is never confirmed. Sonar systems are built on falsification. A contact hypothesis survives only if contradictory evidence fails to destroy it. Bearings must align, returns must persist, motion must obey constraint. When any of these fail, the hypothesis is rejected. Rejection is decisive. Nothing remains. The predator never forms a hypothesis. Without a hypothesis, there is nothing to falsify. Without falsification, there is no failure. The predator exists outside the logic that governs detection. This is not a loophole. It is a boundary. Detection requires the willingness to be wrong. The system must assume something is there long enough to test that assumption. The predator never grants that interval. It exits perception before assumption hardens. Hardening takes time. Time is segmented. Segments are limited. Limits are enforced. The predator times itself naturally within these limits. There are acoustic regimes where sound behaves almost too well. Long-range convergence zones, stable ducts, smooth layering. In these regimes, sonar confidence rises, detection is strong, interpretation is decisive. The predator avoids these regimes not by choice, but by incompatibility. Its interaction dissolves where coherence peaks. Where coherence drops, it appears. This is not intelligence. It is alignment. Alignment between motion and medium produces invisibility without intent. In these lower coherence regimes, sonar tolerates contradiction. It expects it. Contradiction does not alarm. It reassures. It confirms the environment is behaving normally. Normal behavior absorbs anomaly. The predator never exceeds normality. If it were to generate a singular, undeniable effect, a persistent void, a repeating distortion, a stable shadow attention would follow. It does not. Its effects are always marginal, always distributed, always explainable. Explainable is enough. The system is not deceived. It is satisfied. Satisfaction is the enemy of discovery. Discovery requires dissatisfaction, a mismatch between expectation and observation that cannot be reconciled. The predator ensures reconciliation always remains possible. Possibility prevents escalation. There are no procedures for possible presence. Procedures require certainty gradients. Certainty gradients require accumulation. Accumulation requires persistence. The predator denies persistence by remaining temporally thin. Thin interactions pass through processing like mist through a grid present, then gone, leaving nothing to catch. This thinness also means the predator leaves no scars, no lasting acoustic alteration, no measurable wake. The medium returns to baseline immediately. Baseline is trusted. Trust is not naivete. It is efficiency. Sonar cannot afford to distrust the ocean. Distrust would paralyze operation. The predator benefits from this trust. It becomes part of what is trusted. In effect, the predator is invisible not because it is undetectable, but because it is always detected as something else, something benign, something expected, something already accounted for. Accounting closes inquiry. Once closed, inquiry does not reopen without cause. Cause must be dramatic. The predator is subtle. Subtlety is not weakness, it is durability. Over long durations, this durability ensures the predator's continued irrelevance. It does not accumulate myth. It does not provoke rumor. It does not become legend. Legends require sightings. Sightings require recognition. Recognition never happens. The predator, therefore, remains nameless. It is never described directly. It exists only in the negative space of documentation, in what is not mentioned, not flagged, not discussed. Negative space is stable. The system's understanding of the underwater domain grows richer in some dimensions and poorer in others. Richer in what it tracks well, poorer in what it never sees. The predator lives in that poverty. This is not ignorance in the human sense. It is resolution in the system sense. Resolution means deciding what matters. The predator never matters. As long as it never matters, it will never appear not on sonar, not in reports, not in models. It will remain where it has always been, underwater, present, moving, and absent, by every mechanism designed to know. There is no corrective signal. In complex systems, correction is driven by feedback that exceeds tolerance. Deviations must grow large enough, persist long enough, or repeat often enough to force reconsideration. Without that pressure, models remain intact, parameters remain justified, confidence remains high. The predator never supplies corrective pressure. Its interactions with the medium do not accumulate, they dissipate. Each interaction is resolved locally and forgotten globally. The system's global state remains unchanged. Without global change, there is no incentive to adapt. Adaptation is expensive. Adaptation requires admitting insufficiency. It requires redefining success. It requires opening categories that were previously closed. Systems avoid this unless forced. The predator does not force. There is a difference between being unseen and being unseen by design. The predator occupies the latter condition. Its absence is not accidental. It is the natural outcome of a sensing architecture optimized for stability. Stability requires boundaries. Boundaries require exclusion. Exclusion does not require awareness. The system does not need to know that it is excluding something. Exclusion happens automatically when phenomena fail to meet criteria for inclusion. These criteria are not negotiated in real time. They are fixed by design. Design decisions become ontology. What the system can represent becomes what exists. What it cannot represent becomes indistinguishable from nothing. The predator exists on the other side of representation. This has consequences beyond detection. It affects how risk is conceptualized. Risk models rely on known categories. Unknown categories without impact are not modeled. The predator does not appear in risk assessments because it produces no measurable risk within the system's frame. Risk without metrics does not exist operationally. Thus, even if the predator were to pass through critical areas repeatedly, its passage would not alter planning. It would not influence strategy. It would not change posture. This is not blindness. It is prioritization. Sonar is a tool, not a worldview. It answers specific questions. It does not answer all possible questions about the ocean. The predator lives in questions sonar does not ask. Questions define detection. The system asks, is there a persistent reflector? Is there a coherent emitter? Is there a trackable motion? The predator answers none of these consistently. Therefore, it remains unanswered. This unanswered presence is not a gap to be filled. It is a remainder produced by optimization. All optimized systems produce remainders. They discard what does not contribute to their objective. The predator is discarded continuously. Discarding is silent. Silence is comforting. Comfort reinforces design. Over time, the notion that something could move underwater without appearing on sonar becomes counterintuitive. It contradicts the narrative of coverage and capability. Yet the contradiction is never confronted because there is no evidence demanding confrontation. Demand requires consequence. The predator leaves none. Its passage does not degrade system performance enough to be noticed. It does not correlate with failures. It does not create anomalies that persist. It does not change outcomes. Outcomes are the currency of belief. Without outcome, presence is academic. Academic presence does not influence operation. Thus, the predator exists only as a theoretical possibility. But even that requires articulation. Without articulation, possibility fades into irrelevance. Irrelevance is the final state. The predator does not challenge sonar. It reveals its scope by remaining outside it. This revelation is subtle and therefore unacknowledged. Systems rarely reflect on what they exclude, unless exclusion becomes costly. Here, exclusion is free. The ocean remains vast. Sound continues to propagate. Sonar continues to listen. Tracks appear and disappear as expected. And beneath that surface of expected behavior, something continues to move not because it is powerful, not because it is hidden, but because it occupies a regime where movement does not demand recognition. Recognition is optional. Sonar recognizes what it must. Everything else passes through present for an instant, dissolved into explanation, and gone without trace. The predator remains there, not waiting, not stalking, not acting. Simply moving, underwater, where appearing is never required. At no point does the system become aware that it is incomplete. Completeness is not an objective. Coverage is. Coverage is defined geometrically, temporally, statistically. It is measured in probabilities, not absolutes. A region covered at 95% is considered secure. The remaining 5% is tolerated as noise, uncertainty, or irreducible complexity. The predator exists entirely within that remainder. The remainder is not inspected closely. It is averaged. It is discounted. It is treated as margin. Margins are where systems place everything that does not justify structural change. Structural change is disruptive. Disruption requires urgency. Urgency requires consequence. Consequence requires visibility. Visibility requires representation. The predator denies representation. In doing so, it denies urgency. There is a common assumption that unseen threats grow over time, that persistence leads eventually to detection. This assumption relies on accumulation. The predator does not accumulate. It does not grow louder, larger, or more predictable. It remains constant in its refusal to stabilize. Constancy without persistence is paradoxical only from the outside. From within the system, there is no constancy. There are only isolated moments of variance, each resolved independently. The idea that these moments belong to the same cause never forms. Causality requires linkage. Linkage requires memory. Memory requires relevance. Relevance is never granted. The predator, therefore, does not exist as a continuous entity in the system's timeline. It exists as a sequence of unrelated non-events. Non-events do not combine into narratives. Narratives require events. Without narrative, there is no story of presence, only a smooth operational history. This smoothness is deceptive only if one expects the system to be comprehensive. It is not. It was never intended to be. Sonar was designed to reduce uncertainty to a manageable subset. It does so exceptionally well. The predator lies outside that subset. This is not a flaw, it is an outcome. The ocean offers more information than can be processed. Selection is inevitable. Selection creates blind zones. Blind zones are not empty, they are simply unselected. The predator is unselected. It does not contest selection, it flows with it. Even if multiple systems overlap different frequencies, different geometries, different platforms, synthesis still depends on shared assumptions. Shared assumptions converge toward what is common. The predator avoids commonality. Each system sees something slightly different. None see enough. Without convergence, synthesis fails. Failure here is quiet. The data is correct. The processing is correct. The interpretation is correct. Correctness does not guarantee completeness. This distinction is rarely operationally meaningful. Operations proceed based on what can be confirmed, not on what might exist beyond confirmation. The predator exists beyond confirmation. In some sense, it is already integrated into the system's worldview, not as an entity, but as an allowance. The allowance that not everything will be seen. That allowance is built in, accepted, and unexamined. Unexamined allowances are powerful. They permit stability. They permit confidence. They permit silence. The predator is permitted by silence. It does not intrude. It does not escalate. It does not insist. It moves where movement is absorbed. Over long durations, this relationship does not evolve. There is no arms race. There is no adaptation. There is no discovery. The predator remains what it always was, a consequence of limits. Limits do not change quickly. They shift only when cost appears. There is no cost. Thus, the system continues to operate as designed, believing correctly in its own effectiveness, unaware that effectiveness implies exclusion. The ocean continues to host motion at all scales. Within that motion, something continues to pass through monitored space without ever crossing into representation. It does not need to avoid detection. It never qualifies for it. This is the quietest form of presence, not hidden, not silent, not unreachable, simply unnecessary to acknowledge. Sonar listens for necessity. The predator never becomes necessary, and so it continues underwater, interacting with sound, altering nothing that matters. And never, at any point, appearing on sonar. Eventually, the absence acquires weight without acquiring form, not in the system, in the environment surrounding it. Operators notice nothing. Logs show nothing. Reports confirm stability. Yet the water behaves in ways that remain slightly misaligned with expectation. Not enough to alarm, not enough to investigate. Enough only to persist. Persistence without recognition is the predator's true signature. Sonar is calibrated to detect deviation from baseline, not deviation within baseline. When variability remains inside expected variance, it is absorbed. When it shifts the variance itself, slowly and locally, it is attributed to environment. Environment is infinite. Objects are finite. The predator ensures it is always interpreted as the former. Over time, this produces a subtle effect. Detection models grow increasingly confident in their noise estimates. Variability is expected. Fluctuation is normalized. The system becomes better at ignoring what it cannot resolve. Ignoring improves performance. Performance metrics improve. False alarms decrease. Track stability increases. The system appears refined, mature, complete. Refinement reduces curiosity. Curiosity is not rewarded in operational systems. It produces ambiguity. Ambiguity produces indecision. Indecision is failure. Thus, the predator thrives in refinement. It does not need to remain unchanged. It does not need to evolve. The system evolves away from it on its own. As filters sharpen, marginal phenomena are excluded earlier. As correlation requirements tighten, fleeting coherence is rejected faster. As confidence grows, doubt recedes. The predator is carried away by this tide. There is no record of it being lost, because it was never acquired. There is no trace of evasion, because there was no pursuit. There is no anomaly, because anomaly requires deviation from expectation. Expectation has already adjusted. This is the deepest concealment. Not hiding from the system, but shaping what the system expects. Not actively, not intentionally, inevitably. Systems trained on their own success learn what to ignore. The predator becomes part of that lesson. If at some future point the system were asked directly whether such a presence could exist, the answer would be procedural. It would list constraints, probabilities, tolerances. It would not say no. It would say unlikely. Unlikely is enough. Unlikely closes doors without locking them. It leaves room for exception while denying relevance. It preserves theoretical openness while maintaining operational closure. The predator exists in that gap. Possible, irrelevant, unmodeled. The ocean does not care about likelihood. It does not optimize for detectability. It supports behaviors that do not repeat cleanly, structures that do not reflect neatly, motions that do not persist long enough to matter. Sonar samples. The ocean exceeds. Within that excess, motion continues that never becomes an object, never becomes a process, never becomes a threat. Predation here is not consumption. It is asymmetry of awareness. One system moves. Another system listens. Only one of them knows both are present. The predator does not need to act. Its existence is already sufficient. It moves through volumes that are considered empty. It passes through layers that are treated as noise. It crosses beams that are busy tracking other things. Nothing reacts. Nothing should. The system is correct to do so. Correctness, however, is not completeness. And so the predator remains. Not hidden in shadows, not cloaked in silence, not racing beyond sound, but perfectly aligned with everything the system has decided not to see. Underwater, present, moving, and forever absent. By design, there is no escalation phase. Escalation presumes recognition, and recognition presumes a stable referent. The predator never stabilizes. It does not become louder when ignored. It does not repeat when dismissed. It does not concentrate when dispersed. It remains distributed across moments that never quite touch. Touching would be dangerous. Touching would allow association. Association is the seed of belief. Belief is never planted. The system's safeguards work as intended. Anomalies are filtered. Margins are trimmed. Outliers are excluded. Each safeguard removes a path by which the predator might be acknowledged. None of them are flawed. Together, they are complete. Completeness is relative. The ocean presents more combinations of interaction than any single sensing modality can represent. Sonar chooses which combinations matter by privileging persistence over transience. This choice is unavoidable. Without it, the system would collapse under complexity. The predator occupies transience exclusively. It appears only as brief departures from expectation that resolve before contradiction hardens. Each departure is reconciled locally. Reconciliation is never revisited. Revisitation would require memory. Memory is allocated to what persists. Thus, the predator's passage is always a first time and never a second. It does not return in a way that can be compared. It does not echo its own behavior. It does not leave behind a template. Templates are dangerous to invisibility. Even statistical accumulation fails. The deviations it produces are directionally inconsistent. Sometimes energy dips. Sometimes it smears. Sometimes it refracts oddly. Sometimes it sharpens briefly and then dissolves. The variability prevents clustering. Clustering would attract attention. Attention would invite scrutiny. Scrutiny would change the relationship. The predator remains unchanged by scrutiny because scrutiny never arrives. There are systems that attempt to detect absence directly to measure holes in expected interaction rather than presences. These systems rely on stable expectations. They assume that the environment behaves consistently enough that deviations can be isolated. The predator moves where expectations are least stable. Stability is intermittent underwater. It comes and goes with tides, layers, weather, and time. The predator intersects instability like a current intersecting another current without creating a boundary that can be named. Naming requires edges. Edges never form. The system's internal confidence remains high because nothing challenges it decisively. Confidence is not arrogance. It is a metric of internal consistency. The system is consistent with itself. Self-consistency is not falsifiable. The predator does not need to deceive. Deception implies intent and counterintent. This is simpler. The predator exists as a consequence of how perception is filtered. Filtered perception produces blind corridors. Corridors are not empty. They are merely unobserved. The predator moves through these corridors with no resistance. If the system were ever forced to confront such a presence directly, it would struggle to articulate it. There would be no track to show, no contact to replay, no signature to analyze, only a sense that something does not align, a sense unsupported by admissible data. Unsupported senses do not survive review. Review is ruthless. The predator remains beyond review. This is why it never becomes a problem to be solved. Problems are defined by solvability. This has no handle, no lever, no starting point. No starting point means no investigation. Investigation would require asking a question the system does not know how to phrase. The question is not, what is there? The question would be, what is happening without becoming anything? That question has no operational answer. Thus, the system does not ask it. Sonar continues to perform. The ocean continues to vary. Motion continues to occur. Within that motion, something continues to pass through layers of sound and expectation without ever being fixed, framed, or followed. Not because it hides, because it never becomes something that needs to be found. The predator remains underwater, not as a contact, not as a threat, not as a mystery demanding resolution. but as a moving remainder of perception itself, unseen, unrequired, and therefore enduring. Eventually, the system stops differentiating between absence and normality. Normality is defined statistically. It is the shape of what remains after filtering removes everything that cannot be stabilized. Once filtering has done its work, what is left becomes the reference. The reference then defines what is expected. Anything outside expectation is removed again. This loop is self-reinforcing. The predator does not resist the loop, it completes it. Each of its interactions with sound produces outcomes that are compatible with the tails of distributions already accepted. The tails are wide enough to absorb rare behavior without reshaping the center. Rare behavior that never repeats in the same way never reshapes anything. Reshaping requires pressure. Pressure requires convergence. The predator disperses. There is a subtle distinction between being undetected and being undetectable. The predator is neither in the absolute sense. It is detectable in fragments. It is detectable briefly. It is detectable incompletely. What it is not is admissible. Admissibility is the gate. Admissibility requires coherence across dimensions, time, space, frequency, confidence. The predator denies coherence by spreading its influence thinly across all of them. No single dimension carries enough weight to justify belief. Belief remains unformed. Unformed belief produces no trace. The system's internal language reflects this. There are no variables for half objects, for almost tracks, for influences without anchors. These states exist transiently inside buffers and then vanish. The language of the system has no nouns for them. What cannot be named cannot be retained. Retention is selective by design. As retention sharpens, the predator's window narrows further. What once left faint residues now leaves none. The system has learned, not consciously, but structurally, how to let go faster. Letting go is efficiency. Efficiency is rewarded. Nothing in this process feels like loss to the system. Loss implies that something valued was present. This was never valued. It never qualified. It never rose high enough to be missed. The predator is not lost. It is continuously excluded. Exclusion has no emotional signature. It produces no alerts. It produces no metrics. It produces nothing to discuss. Discussion requires artifacts. Artifacts require persistence. Persistence is denied. In rare cases, external constraints force attention into the margins. Scientific surveys, anomaly-focused experiments, exploratory deployments. In these contexts, analysts widen tolerances and hold ambiguity longer. They sometimes glimpse patterns that do not fit comfortably. These glimpses remain inconclusive. Inconclusiveness is not failure. It is simply insufficient to act upon. Action is the threshold that matters. Without action, perception fades back into background. The predator returns to irrelevance. Irrelevance is stable across time. Time does not accumulate evidence against irrelevance, because evidence is never allowed to aggregate. Each moment stands alone. Standalone moments do not build cases. Cases require narratives. Narratives require continuity. Continuity is the one thing the predator never grants. This does not make it powerful. It makes it persistent. Persistence without visibility is not dominance. It is coexistence on unequal terms. One system perceives selectively. Another moves without needing to be perceived. The inequality is structural. Sonar will always privilege what can be followed. Following requires agreement between motion and model, between signal and expectation. The predator never agrees. It does not disagree either. It simply passes through the terms of agreement without engaging them. The ocean offers endless pathways for such passage. Sound is never uniform. Water is never still. Layers never remain aligned long enough to guarantee coherence. The predator uses none of this deliberately. Deliberation is unnecessary. The relationship is passive. Sonar listens. The ocean moves. Some motion never intersects with belief. That motion does not announce itself. It does not wait to be noticed. It does not leave reminders. It continues. Underwater, within sound, within variability, something persists that is never captured, never tracked, never denied, because denial would require recognition. The predator remains there, not hidden by silence, not cloaked by speed, not erased by noise, but sustained entirely by the limits of what observation must be in order to function at all. At some point, the question of existence becomes irrelevant. Systems do not require existence to be proven in order to function. They require reliability. Reliability is measured by consistency of outcomes, not by completeness of perception. As long as outcomes remain stable, the unseen remains unexamined. The predator persists within that stability. It does not introduce variance large enough to disturb forecasts. It does not alter detection statistics in a measurable way. It does not correlate with failures. It does not leave a signature that would justify a new parameter. Without parameters, there is nothing to tune. Tuning is how systems acknowledge gaps. The predator produces no tunable error. Its passage does not degrade performance enough to appear in diagnostics. It does not cause misclassification spikes. It does not distort tracks that are already established. It exists orthogonally to the main flow of information. Orthogonality is invisible. Signals that matter align with processing axes. They strengthen or weaken metrics the system already knows how to measure. Signals that do not align are projected away. Projection is not deletion. It is irrelevance. The predator exists in projections. In long-term operation, the system's understanding of the underwater environment becomes increasingly abstracted. Details that do not support action are smoothed out. Complexity is reduced to maintain speed, clarity, and trust. What remains is a functional approximation. Approximation is sufficient. The predator lives in what is approximated away. There is no contradiction here. Approximation does not claim to be complete. It claims to be useful. Usefulness is judged by success, not by exhaustiveness. Success is defined narrowly. Did the system detect what it needed to detect? Did it track what it needed to track? Did it support decisions? The answer remains yes. Thus, the predator is excluded not by failure, but by success. Success narrows attention. As attention narrows, the cost of widening it increases. Every additional degree of openness invites ambiguity. Ambiguity erodes confidence. Confidence underpins authority. Authority is critical. Systems that inform decisions must appear certain. They must provide answers that can be trusted. They cannot dwell on possibilities that cannot be resolved. The predator cannot be resolved. Resolution would require altering the criteria of reality. That alteration is never justified. Over time, the system's silence regarding such motion becomes indistinguishable from knowledge that such motion does not exist. Silence is interpreted as confirmation. Absence of evidence becomes evidence of absence, not logically, but operationally. Operational logic is what matters. The predator exists outside that logic. It does not accumulate myth, because myths require witnesses. It does not accumulate fear, because fear requires recognition. It does not accumulate meaning, because meaning requires context. Context never forms. The ocean provides endless context. The predator refuses to stay inside any single one long enough to be framed. This refusal is not defiance. It is simply movement through a medium that never holds still. Sound bends. Layers shift. Currents slide. Within this constant motion, The predator's own motion never stands out. Standing out would be fatal to invisibility. Invisibility here is not a property. It is a relationship between what moves and what listens, between what varies and what expects variation. As long as expectation remains broad enough to absorb deviation, deviation disappears. The predator ensures deviation never sharpens. It remains diffuse, transient, explainable, forgettable. The system forgets correctly. Forgetting is not error. It is optimization. Optimization leaves remnants. The predator is such a remnant. It is not what sonar fails to see. It is what sonar was never meant to look for. Underwater, within sound, within the limits of representation, motion continues that will never condense into a signal worth keeping. The predator moves there, not concealed by darkness, not protected by silence, not defended by speed, protected only by the fact that no system can afford to treat everything as something, and so it remains, present, moving, interacting, and absent, always absent, from sonar. Eventually, the absence becomes indistinguishable from certainty. Certainty does not require proof when systems have operated long enough without contradiction. It emerges from repetition of success, from the smooth functioning of processes that never encounter a reason to doubt themselves. Over time, this certainty hardens into an implicit claim. What has not appeared does not need to be considered. The predator exists beyond consideration, not because it is disproven, but because it is unnecessary to explain outcomes. Outcomes are the only currency that matters. As long as outcomes align with expectation, causes remain secondary. Secondary causes are not pursued. The predator never becomes a primary cause. There are no after-action analyses triggered by its passage. No discrepancies require reconciliation. No failures demand root cause investigation. Everything that matters continues to work. Working systems do not introspect deeply. Introspection slows operation. The predator benefits from momentum. Momentum carries the system forward along established paths of interpretation. Deviations that do not interrupt that momentum are flattened. They are treated as surface roughness on an otherwise smooth trajectory. Surface roughness does not alter direction. The predator is surface roughness in time. It creates no obstacle. It creates no resistance. It is simply there, briefly affecting sound in ways that are absorbed by tolerance. Tolerance is not infinite, but it is wide enough. The system's tolerances are calibrated against known variability. Unknown variability that mimics known variability is absorbed without comment. The predator never exceeds mimicry. Mimicry is not imitation. It is coincidence of effect. The ocean already produces enough complexity that additional complexity can hide inside it indefinitely. This is why the predator does not need to evolve. It does not need to adapt to new sensors or new algorithms. As systems become more sophisticated, they become more constrained by their own need for coherence. Coherence is fragile. To protect coherence, interpretation becomes stricter. Strict interpretation excludes edge cases faster. The predator is an edge case by nature. Thus, progress strengthens invisibility. This inversion is rarely acknowledged. Advancement is assumed to reduce blind spots. In practice, it often sharpens them. What lies just outside refined models becomes harder to see than what lay outside crude ones. Crude systems blurred everything. Refined systems reject precisely. Rejection is final. The predator is rejected before it is noticed. In this sense, invisibility is not passive. It is reinforced actively by every improvement that narrows acceptable behavior. The system becomes better at knowing what it expects, and worse at entertaining what it does not. Expectation is efficient. Efficiency is rewarded. The predator remains efficient to ignore. If someday an external force were to demand acknowledgement, a requirement to explain anomalies that never mattered before, the system would struggle to respond. There would be no archive to consult, no evidence to assemble, only the realization that something had been consistently filtered out. Filtered does not mean erased. It means never integrated. Integration is the act that turns motion into meaning. The predator denies integration by remaining fractionated across time and context. Each fragment alone is harmless. Together, they never meet. The ocean allows this easily. It is vast enough to support infinite fragmentation, without loss of continuity in reality, only in perception. Reality does not need continuity to exist. Perception does. Sonar constructs continuity from fragments. The predator ensures fragments never align. This alignment failure is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It does not feel like loss. It feels like normal operation. Normal operation is the strongest concealment available. Thus, the predator persists without resistance. It is not hunted. It is not defended against. It is not even acknowledged as a possibility worth modeling. It moves where modeling is weakest, between updates, across layers, within variability, through tolerances. It does not hide from sound. It hides from belief, and belief, once settled, rarely looks back. Sonar listens forward, not sideways. It builds its world from what can be followed. Beyond that forward gaze, motion continues freely unrecorded, unchallenged, unrequired to ever appear. The predator remains there, underwater, moving through sound as through water itself, leaving no wake in the systems that measure, because it never disturbs what they have decided must matter. Over time, the system's silence acquires authority. Silence, when consistent, is interpreted as validation, not of absence in the physical sense, but of sufficiency in the operational sense. The system has listened, processed, filtered, and concluded repeatedly that nothing requires further attention. This repetition transforms restraint into certainty. Certainty simplifies everything. Models stabilize. Thresholds feel justified. Historical data supports the present configuration. The system becomes confident not because it sees everything, but because it sees enough. Enough is a powerful word. The predator remains outside that measure. It does not disrupt missions. It does not alter statistics in ways that survive averaging. It does not challenge classification hierarchies. It does not demand new vocabulary. It remains compatible with every assumption already in place. Compatibility is invisibility. A phenomenon that forces new language is disruptive. A phenomenon that fits existing explanations, even loosely, disappears into them. The predator fits loosely everywhere and precisely nowhere. Precision is required for belief. Belief never forms. In the long term, this creates a peculiar asymmetry. The system becomes increasingly articulate about what it can see and increasingly inarticulate about what it cannot. The unseen is not described as unseen. It is simply absent from discourse. Discourse defines reality. What is not discussed does not exist operationally. It does not influence training. It does not influence design. It does not influence doctrine. It becomes irrelevant by omission. Omission is not denial. It is optimization. The predator is optimized away. Even if future systems were to become more sensitive, more adaptive, more computationally powerful, the same constraint would remain. Interpretation would still require coherence. Coherence would still require persistence. Persistence would still require behavior that agrees with models. The predator never agrees. Agreement is not compromise. It is alignment between motion and expectation. The predator's motion never aligns long enough to be claimed. Claiming is a commitment. Commitment carries cost. The system avoids cost unless forced. Nothing forces. The ocean remains complex enough to justify every dismissal. Every unexplained interaction can be attributed to layers, currents, scatter, interference. These explanations are not excuses. They are accurate descriptions of a medium that resists simplification. The predator does not need to add complexity. It only needs to exist within it. Complexity hides everything equally well. In this environment, sonar does not fail. It succeeds within bounds. The predator exists beyond those bounds, without contesting them. This coexistence is stable. Stability is the final defense against recognition. Recognition would require instability, a repeated mismatch that cannot be smoothed, averaged, or ignored. The predator never produces that mismatch. It produces many small ones, each resolved independently. Independence prevents accumulation. Accumulation creates meaning. Meaning never forms. Thus, the predator's existence is never elevated from possibility to problem. It remains a theoretical remainder, unarticulated and unnecessary. The system continues to listen, confident in its silence. The ocean continues to move, indifferent to confidence. Within that movement, something continues to pass through sound fields, refract waves slightly, redistribute energy briefly, then dissolve back into the background. No trace persists. No memory forms. No belief is challenged. The predator remains underwater, not as an anomaly, not as a contact, not as a mystery demanding resolution, but as a quiet consequence of how perception must narrow in order to function at all. And as long as perception narrows, there will always be motion that escapes it, not by hiding, but by never asking to be seen. Eventually, the distinction between detection and relevance collapses. The system does not ask whether something is present, it asks whether something matters. Presence without consequence is indistinguishable from absence. This equivalence is not philosophical, it is procedural. Processing chains terminate early when no downstream action is implied. The predator exists entirely within that termination. It does not cross thresholds that trigger response. It does not degrade performance in a measurable way. It does not alter decisions. Therefore, it does not matter. What does not matter is not pursued. Pursuit is costly. The system optimizes for what justifies pursuit. Over long operational periods, this optimization becomes self-confirming. Because nothing has justified pursuit, the criteria for pursuit feel correct. The absence of challenge reinforces the belief that the environment has been adequately characterized. Characterization is never complete, but completeness is not required. The predator is excluded by sufficiency. Sufficiency is dangerous only if one expects omniscience. Sonar does not. It expects reliability. Reliability means that when something must be seen, it will be seen. The predator never becomes something that must be seen. Must implies urgency. Urgency implies consequence. The predator produces none that are legible. Even if its passage coincides with other events, attribution never consolidates. Correlation windows close. Hypotheses decay. The system does not hold suspicion in reserve. Suspicion without confirmation is treated as noise. Noise is discarded. Discarding is final. This finality does not register as loss. Loss requires awareness that something valuable was present. The predator never acquires value. Value is assigned through classification. Classification never occurs. There is an implicit contract between sensing systems and the environments they monitor. The system promises to detect what can be stabilized into meaning. The environment promises nothing. Everything else is left outside the contract. The predator lives outside the contract. It does not violate expectations because it never enters them. It does not evade rules because it never triggers them. It does not resist interpretation because interpretation never begins. This is why the predator is never described as stealthy. Stealth implies opposition. This is indifference. Indifference is more effective. The ocean is indifferent to being known. The predator mirrors that indifference at the scale of interaction that sonar operates within. It does not announce itself. It does not conceal itself. It simply persists in a form that never condenses into a signal worth keeping. Condensation is the key. Sound condenses into echoes. Echoes condense into detections. Detections condense into tracks. The predator interrupts condensation at every stage without blocking it outright. Sound still propagates. Echoes still occur. Detections still register briefly. What fails is accumulation. Accumulation requires patience. Patience is limited. The system's patience is calibrated to expected behavior. Anything that demands more patience than expected is excluded. The predator always demands slightly more. Slightly more is enough. In this way, invisibility is maintained not by absolute negation, but by incremental excess just beyond tolerance, just beyond integration, just beyond belief. The predator is always one step outside the system's willingness to wait. Waiting is costly. The system does not wait, and so the predator moves freely, not because it is powerful, not because it is advanced, not because it is unknown, but because it occupies the narrow, persistent space between what is sensed and what is worth remembering. That space is vast. Sonar listens at its edges. The ocean fills it continuously. Within that fill, motion occurs that never quite resolves, never quite repeats, never quite insists. The predator remains there underwater, present, interacting, and permanently absent, not as a failure of detection, but as a consequence of how detection must choose. The system continues. The silence holds, and nothing, at any point, requires that this change. At last, the system forgets that forgetting is happening. Forgetting is not recorded. There is no counter for discarded ambiguity, no ledger of excluded possibilities. What is not integrated leaves no scar. The system's memory remains smooth, uninterrupted, confident. Over time, this smoothness becomes indistinguishable from completeness. Completeness is assumed, not asserted. The predator persists beneath this assumption. It does not require concealment strategies. It does not require adaptation. The environment itself performs concealment continuously, and the system cooperates by compressing complexity into manageability. Between compression and concealment, nothing remains that could be pointed to. Pointing requires reference. Reference requires continuity. Continuity never forms. The predator's movement is not erratic. It is not chaotic. It is simply unaligned with the axes along which interpretation accumulates. It crosses grids diagonally. It intersects beams briefly. It inhabits gradients rather than nodes. Nodes are remembered. Gradients are smoothed. Smoothing removes edges. Edges define objects. The predator has no edges. In technical terms, it is always in transition. Not transitioning between states that the system recognizes, but transitioning through states faster than categorization can stabilize. Each state is valid. None are persistent. Validity without persistence is ignored. The system cannot pause to ask whether persistence is the correct criterion. Pausing would mean sacrificing responsiveness elsewhere. The trade-off is fixed. Responsiveness wins. Winning narrows vision. The predator exists in what is sacrificed. There is an implicit hierarchy in sensing. Detect first what can be acted upon. What cannot be acted upon is deferred indefinitely. Deferred indefinitely is equivalent to non-existent. The predator cannot be acted upon. Action requires location. Location requires stability. Stability requires agreement. Agreement never occurs. Thus, the predator never becomes actionable. It never becomes real in the only sense that matters to an operational system. Reality, here, is not existence. It is utility. The predator has none. Utility governs attention more strongly than truth. Truth without utility is noise. Noise is filtered. The system filters continuously, efficiently, correctly. Correct filtering removes everything that would overload interpretation. Among those removals are entire classes of motion that never demand engagement. The predator is one of them. If the predator were suddenly absent from the ocean, nothing would change in the system's outputs. No metric would shift. No blind spot would close. No capability would be lost. This lack of impact confirms the system's implicit judgment. Whatever that was, it was irrelevant. Irrelevance is the final verdict. The predator does not contest the verdict. It continues to move through sound fields that bend, scatter, and fade. It continues to intersect beams that are busy confirming other things. It continues to exist in volumes that are statistically accounted for and therefore ignored. It does not leave absence behind. It leaves normality. Normality is the most complete erasure possible. The ocean remains vast enough to host countless such remainders, motions, interactions, presences that never condense into objects of concern. Sonar samples a fraction and calls it the world. The predator exists in the remainder of the remainder. Not hidden, not silent, not exceptional, simply outside the necessity of being known. Sonar listens for necessity. Beyond that, the water carries sound, the medium shifts, interactions occur, and motion continues without inscription. The predator remains there underwater, moving through layers of explanation, passing through filters, dissolving into averages. And as long as perception must choose, it will remain exactly where it is, present, persistent, and never required to appear. Eventually, the system's confidence becomes indistinguishable from certainty. Certainty is not declared. It is inferred from time without disruption. Each cycle that completes without contradiction reinforces the assumption that the domain has been sufficiently mapped. Sufficiently does not mean entirely. It means adequately, for purpose. Purpose narrows perception. The predator exists beyond purpose. Sonar is deployed to answer specific questions. Where are stable objects? How are they moving? What category do they belong to? These questions presuppose that meaningful presence will cooperate long enough to be questioned. The predator never cooperates. It does not deny interrogation. It simply leaves before interrogation forms. Formation takes time. Time is partitioned. Partitioning creates seams. The predator moves along seams, between pings, between integration windows, between confidence updates. These intervals are not empty. They are dense with unprocessed possibility. The system collapses them into continuity for efficiency. What cannot be collapsed is released. Release is quiet. Quietness accumulates. Overextended operation. The system's silence regarding such motion is interpreted not as a lack of information, but as a sign of mastery. Mastery implies that nothing unexpected remains. Unexpectedness requires surprise. Surprise requires contradiction. The predator never contradicts. It aligns with explanation before contradiction can mature. This alignment is not exact. It is sufficient. Sufficiency is all that is required to terminate inquiry. Inquiry is optional. In theoretical terms, the predator exists as a high-dimensional phenomenon projected into a low-dimensional interpretive space. The projection destroys structure. What remains is noise-shaped residue. Residue is discarded. Discarding is irreversible. The system does not track what it discards. There is no inverse operation. Once projection occurs, information is lost permanently. This loss is not considered harmful because it affects only what cannot be acted upon. Action defines harm. The predator does not interfere with action. Even when its passage coincides with moments of uncertainty, those moments resolve normally. The system recalibrates, adapts, and continues. no causal chain is left unresolved. Unresolved chains are dangerous. The predator leaves none. In this sense, the predator is not an intruder. It is a resident of the system's blind resolution, the place where uncertainty is resolved by dismissal rather than by understanding. Dismissal is not failure, it is efficiency. Efficiency accumulates advantage over time. The system becomes faster, cleaner, more decisive. Each improvement further compresses the space in which ambiguous motion could survive long enough to be noticed. Compression strengthens invisibility. The predator benefits from every optimization. There is a paradox here. The better the system becomes at detecting what it is designed to detect, the less room it leaves for anything else. Detection sharpens, but scope narrows. The predator exists in scope, not in detection. Scope is rarely measured. Metrics focus on what is found, not on what is excluded. Excluded phenomena leave no metrics. No metrics, no concern. Concern never forms. The predator does not need concealment. It does not need adaptation. It does not need intelligence. It needs only that perception remain purposeful and finite. Perception must remain finite. Infinity is unusable. The ocean is infinite in complexity. Sonar samples what it can afford to sample. Everything else passes through unsampled, unmodeled, unnamed. The predator passes there, not hidden in shadows, not cloaked in silence, not racing beyond sound. It moves at the speed of dismissal. Dismissal is immediate. As long as dismissal remains the default response to what cannot be integrated, the predator will remain where it is not, as an anomaly waiting to be found, but as a consequence of how knowing must limit itself in order to act. Sonar listens. The system concludes. The ocean exceeds. And within that excess, motion continues, present, persistent, and permanently unnecessary to recognize. At a certain depth of operation, absence no longer feels incomplete. It feels finished. The system does not sense a missing piece. It senses closure. Every cycle ends cleanly. Every process resolves. Every uncertainty is either integrated or dismissed. Nothing lingers long enough to suggest unfinished business. Unfinished business would imply obligation. Obligation would demand response. The predator never creates obligation. It does not force a choice. It does not delay resolution. It does not interfere with closure. Its passage coincides perfectly with the system's ability to conclude without residue. Residue is the enemy of automation. Automation thrives on clean endings. The predator leaves none. In this environment, even the idea of continuous monitoring becomes misleading. Monitoring implies vigilance. Vigilance implies readiness for interruption. In reality, the system is not vigilant. It is selective. It is designed to respond only to what matches its grammar. Grammar defines reality. Sonar's grammar consists of echoes, bearings, persistence, motion vectors. Anything that cannot be expressed in these terms does not enter the sentence. It remains unsaid. The predator is unsayable, not because it is ineffable, but because the language of detection has no clause for it. Languages do not evolve spontaneously. They evolve under pressure. Pressure comes from failure. Failure requires recognition. Recognition never occurs. The grammar remains unchanged. Within this grammar, the ocean becomes readable. Complex, but readable. Chaotic, but bounded. The system builds a story of the underwater domain that is internally consistent and externally useful. Usefulness outweighs completeness. The predator exists in what usefulness excludes. There is no contradiction in this. Every representational system sacrifices resolution to remain operable. Maps discard detail. Models discard nuance. Sonar discards motion that refuses to stabilize. The predator is discarded continuously. Discarding is not noticed because it happens before awareness. It is pre-attentive. By the time attention engages, nothing remains. Attention engages only after filtering. Filtering is ruthless. The predator survives, filtering only as nothing. This nothingness is not empty. It is full of motion, interaction, and consequence, just not consequence that propagates into decision. Decision is the threshold. Without decision, there is no event. The predator does not become an event. Even if the system were to be asked directly whether something could move underwater without appearing on sonar, the answer would be procedural. It would cite noise floors, environmental variability, edge cases. It would not deny possibility. It would simply note improbability. Improbability is enough to dismiss. Dismissal is not disbelief. It is prioritization. The predator is deprioritized to zero. Zero is indistinguishable from none. Thus, the predator is not missing from sonar displays. It was never intended to be there. Displays show what must be acted upon. Everything else is filtered away. Action defines existence. Without action, presence dissolves. The predator moves without asking for action. It crosses beams that are busy confirming other truths. It passes through layers that are already unstable. It alters sound just enough to be consistent with variability. Consistency with variability is perfect camouflage. No anomaly stands out. No pattern stabilizes. No history forms. History is where meaning accumulates. The predator has no history. Without history, there is no future recognition. The system continues, cycle after cycle, confident in its silence, supported by its success. The ocean continues to exceed representation. And within that excess, something continues to move, not as a mystery, awaiting discovery, not as a threat, preparing to emerge, but as a permanent remainder of perception itself, underwater, present, moving, and always, already dismissed, before it could ever appear. Eventually, absence becomes indistinguishable from design intent. What began as a limitation is absorbed as a feature. The system is not merely tolerant of what it does not see, it relies on not seeing it. Performance depends on exclusion. Stability depends on narrowing. The act of ignoring becomes foundational. Foundation is never questioned. The predator exists beneath the foundation, not above it. There is no diagnostic for what the system never attempts to diagnose. Self-tests confirm internal consistency, not external completeness. If all modules agree with each other, the system passes. Agreement replaces verification. Verification would require an external referent. The predator provides none. In this state, even hypothetical scenarios struggle to gain traction. Any suggestion of persistent, unseen motion is evaluated against existing data. Existing data shows no disruption, no correlation, no consequence. The suggestion is dismissed as unnecessary. Unnecessary is the most final category. Not false, not impossible, simply unneeded. The predator is unneeded. Over time, this logic shapes intuition. Analysts, designers, and operators internalize the system's silence. Silence becomes reassurance. Reassurance becomes belief. Belief becomes invisibility. Invisibility is social as well as technical. Once a phenomenon is socially invisible, it cannot be discussed meaningfully. Discussion requires shared reference. Shared reference requires artifacts. Artifacts never existed. Thus, the predator is absent even from imagination. Imagination is bounded by language. Language is bounded by detection. Detection never occurred. The ocean remains a domain of layered uncertainty, but only some uncertainties are allowed to persist. Those that do not interfere with operation are resolved by neglect. Neglect is not passive, it is systematic. Systematic neglect is efficient. Efficiency accelerates cycles. Faster cycles leave less time for marginal interpretation. Marginal phenomena are excluded earlier and more completely. The predator benefits from speed. Not speed of motion, speed of conclusion. Conclusion arrives before curiosity. Curiosity requires slack. Slack is eliminated by optimization. Optimization tightens the system around its purpose. Purpose excludes everything else. The predator lives in everything else. It is not a singular presence. It does not need to be. It may be distributed, intermittent, conditional. These qualities prevent consolidation. Consolidation would force naming. Naming would be dangerous. Names invite tracking. The predator remains unnamed. Without a name, there is no category. Without a category, there is no memory. Without memory, there is no escalation. Escalation never occurs. The system continues to listen, process, decide, and forget flawlessly by its own criteria. It is not blind, it is focused. Focus is selective blindness. Selective blindness is not a flaw, it is a requirement. The predator exists because requirements exist. If sonar attempted to reveal everything, it would reveal nothing reliably. Reliability demands sacrifice. The predator is the sacrifice. Sacrifice leaves no trace. No marker indicates what was given up. Only the functioning system remains. Functioning systems inspire trust. Trust ends inquiry. Inquiry would threaten efficiency. Thus, the predator remains protected by success itself. It does not need darkness. It does not need silence. It does not need distance. It needs only that systems continue to work. As long as sonar works, as long as outputs align with expectation, as long as decisions are supported, the predator will remain outside relevance. It will continue to move through sound fields that are already busy making sense of other things. It will continue to intersect layers that are already unstable. It will continue to exist in the margins that are permanently averaged away. Not hidden, not elusive, not mysterious in the dramatic sense, simply structurally excluded. Underwater, within the excess of reality, motion persists that will never condense into a signal worth keeping. The predator remains there, present, moving, interacting, and perfectly safe inside the limits of what perception must ignore in order to function at all. In the end, the system stops distinguishing between what is filtered and what never existed. Filtering becomes invisible to itself. It is no longer experienced as an active process, but as a natural property of perception. What reaches awareness is assumed to be complete enough to stand for the whole. Everything else is treated as theoretical excess. Excess is harmless. The predator exists as harmless excess. Harmlessness is not a judgment about behavior. It is a judgment about impact. The predator's impact never crosses into consequence. It does not force reallocation of resources. It does not change probabilities that matter. It does not create pressure. Pressure would force revision. Revision never occurs. This creates a peculiar inversion. The more reliable the system becomes, the less incentive it has to question its own exclusions. Reliability masks incompleteness. Incompleteness, when stable, becomes invisible. The predator is stabilized invisibility. It does not lurk. It does not wait. It does not prepare. It simply continues. Sonar's models assume that anything persistent will eventually be seen. This assumption holds for most things that matter operationally. The predator is persistent without being stable. It persists as change, not as form. Change without form is not representable. Representation demands boundaries. Boundaries never appear. Every attempt to impose them dissolves into explanation. Refraction, scatter, turbulence, interference. The vocabulary of dismissal is extensive, precise, and correct. It absorbs everything that does not insist. Insistence is required for escalation. The predator never insists. There is no anomaly that grows louder with time, no signal that sharpens with repetition, no trace that accumulates across deployments. Without accumulation, there is no narrative. Narrative is how systems remember. Without narrative, memory fragments. Fragments are useless. The predator ensures fragmentation. If one were to assemble all the moments of unexplained acoustic behavior across years and locations, patterns might emerge. But assembly requires intent. Intent requires suspicion. Suspicion requires prior belief. Belief never forms. The system does not collect what it does not value. What it does not collect cannot be assembled later. Retrospective discovery becomes impossible because the raw material was never preserved. This is not negligence. It is design. Design prioritizes immediacy over hindsight. The predator thrives in immediacy. Its presence is always now, never then. By the time data could be reviewed, it has already been summarized, filtered, reduced. Reduction is irreversible. The predator is reduced to zero. Zero is comfortable. Zero simplifies models. Zero stabilizes predictions. Zero reassures. The ocean continues to host motion that does not resolve into zero, but the system insists on zero where resolution fails. This insistence is not stubbornness, it is necessity. Necessity defines truth. Truth, here, is what supports continued operation. The predator does not oppose operation. It coexists with it without friction. Friction would be detectable. Detection would change everything. Nothing changes. Thus, the predator remains an invisible constant, not an error term to be corrected, not a threat to be mitigated, not a mystery to be solved. It is a remainder that never becomes salient. Salience is a function of contrast. Contrast requires isolation. Isolation never happens. The predator is always contextualized, always embedded, always explainable away. Explainability is erasure. Over time, erasure becomes total. Not because the predator disappears, but because the system's need to account for it disappears. Accounting is optional. Function is not. The system functions. The ocean moves. Within that movement, something continues to pass through sound and expectation alike, never condensing into a mark that must be remembered. It does not hide. It does not flee. It does not announce. It simply exists in the narrow corridor between perception and necessity, a corridor that grows wider as systems grow more certain of themselves. Underwater, within sound, beyond relevance, motion continues. And as long as relevance defines reality, the predator will remain exactly where it is, present, persistent, and perfectly absent from sonar. Eventually, the system's map replaces the territory. What is charted becomes what exists. What is not charted becomes undefined. Space, not unknown, but unnecessary. The distinction matters. Unknown invites inquiry. Unnecessary invites neglect. Neglect is stable. The predator exists within neglected space. Neglected space is not empty. It is full of assumptions, doing work silently. Assumptions about what matters. Assumptions about what repeats. Assumptions about what would announce itself if it were important. The predator violates none of these assumptions directly. It moves in ways that never force contradiction. It never insists on importance. It never demands attention. Demand is the threshold. Without demand, attention remains elsewhere. The system's attention economy is finite. Every unit of attention devoted to ambiguity is a unit not devoted to clarity. Clarity is valued. Ambiguity is tolerated only briefly. Brief tolerance is enough for the predator. It intersects perception during moments when ambiguity is already expected. Transitions, boundary conditions, unstable layers. In these moments, the system loosens its grip intentionally, knowing that interpretation would be unreliable anyway. Reliability is preserved by letting go. Letting go is not ignorance. It is judgment. The predator benefits from judgment exercised in advance. As the system matures, it learns where interpretation is least profitable. It learns to avoid spending effort where returns are low. These zones become operational shadows not because sensors cannot reach them, but because interpretation chooses not to linger. The predator moves through these shadows. Shadows are not blind spots. They are prioritized absences. Prioritization is deliberate. Deliberate absence is invisible to audit. Audits look for errors, not for choices that succeeded. Success is measured by continuity of operation. Operation continues uninterrupted. Thus, the predator never appears as a deviation from plan. It is incorporated into planning implicitly, as part of what does not need to be addressed. Addressing requires framing. Framing requires boundaries. Boundaries never stabilize. In this way, the predator becomes an ambient condition, like background radiation, like thermal noise, like microturbulence present, measurable in theory, irrelevant in practice. Practice defines reality. Reality, here, is what affects decisions. The predator affects none. It does not change routes. It does not alter posture. It does not influence timing. Influence is the currency of recognition. Without influence, presence dissolves. The system becomes so accustomed to this dissolution that even its absence would not be noticed. If the predator ceased to exist tomorrow, there would be no before and after to compare. No metric would shift. No silence would deepen. This symmetry confirms the system's stance. What leaves no trace when gone leaves no trace when present. Trace is the only proof that matters. The predator leaves no trace because trace requires persistence within interpretive frames. The predator never stays inside any frame long enough. Frames are rigid. The ocean is not. The predator follows the ocean. It moves with gradients, not against them. It aligns with transitions, not with stable volumes. It inhabits moments of change rather than states. States are remembered. Changes are averaged. Averaging erases direction. Direction would suggest intent. Intent would invite interpretation. Interpretation never arrives. Thus, the predator remains a moving remainder, not an exception to the system, but a consequence of it. A phenomenon that exists precisely because perception must choose, compress, and conclude. The system concludes constantly. Each conclusion closes a door. Behind those doors, motion continues, not accumulating, not escalating, not demanding, simply persisting as part of a world that exceeds its own descriptions. Sonar listens where listening is useful. Beyond that usefulness, sound still propagates, water still shifts, and something continues to move in ways that never condense into necessity. Underwater, present, moving, and always already, beyond the point where appearing would matter at all. At a certain scale, perception ceases to be about discovery and becomes about maintenance. The system no longer seeks new information. It preserves coherence. It confirms what is already assumed. Each cycle verifies that the world remains legible in the same way it was before. Stability is not questioned, it is reaffirmed. The predator exists outside reaffirmation. It does not contradict the picture. It does not enrich it. It does not require revision. Revisions are rare. Rare events demand attention only when they repeat with consequence. The predator repeats without consequence and produces consequence without repetition. This inversion ensures that no feedback loop ever closes. Feedback loops are how systems learn. Learning never engages. There is no trigger for curiosity because curiosity would require friction. Friction would require resistance. Resistance would require persistence. The predator does not resist. It flows. Flow is the least detectable form of motion. Sonar excels at detecting interruption echoes that bounce, signatures that linger, objects that displace water in stable ways. Flow displaces without interrupting. It bends paths rather than blocking them. It redistributes energy without creating edges. The predator behaves like flow, not metaphorically, structurally. It is present as modulation rather than obstruction. Modulation is subtle. It alters parameters without violating them. It stays within tolerance. Tolerance is generous by necessity. The ocean enforces generosity. Too strict a tolerance would overwhelm any system with false alarms. Generosity absorbs nuance. Nuance disappears. The predator survives as nuance. Even when systems attempt to model uncertainty explicitly, they do so by bounding it. They define ranges, distributions, envelopes. Anything within the envelope is acceptable. Anything outside demands explanation. The predator never leaves the envelope. It reshapes the envelope locally, briefly, then moves on. By the time reshaping could be measured, the envelope has already shifted again. Measurement lags reality. Lag creates blindness. Blindness here is not darkness. It is motion beyond synchronization. Synchronization is fragile. The predator exists where synchronization breaks down naturally, where layers shear, where gradients slide, where sound paths fold unpredictably. These regions are known, charted, and discounted. Discounting is policy. Policy becomes instinct. Instinct guides interpretation faster than analysis. The predator moves faster than analysis needs to begin. Thus, it never becomes something to analyze. There is no alert that says something is missing. Systems do not alert on absence unless absence is defined as failure. Here, absence is expected. Expectation neutralizes alarm. The predator aligns with expectation so perfectly that it disappears inside it. This alignment is not mimicry, it is compatibility. The predator's interaction with the medium produces outputs that fit comfortably into every category already reserved for the ocean itself. The ocean is allowed to be complex. Objects are not. The predator ensures it is treated as the former. This distinction protects it absolutely. As long as the system draws a hard line between environment and target, anything that remains convincingly environmental will never be pursued. The predator never crosses that line. Crossing would require insistence. Insistence would produce structure. Structure would be detected. The predator remains unstructured long enough to pass through every interpretive gate. This does not make it powerful. It makes it uninteresting. Uninteresting phenomena are infinite. Sonar survives by ignoring most of them. The predator survives by being one of them. There is no drama in this relationship, no climax, no revelation, no turning point. The system does not wake up to its own limits. Limits are accepted silently. Acceptance is the final stage. The predator exists in what is accepted without comment. It continues to move through monitored volumes without generating tracks, through sound fields without producing echoes that persist, through layers without leaving wakes that can be followed. Not because it is invisible, because it never becomes something that needs to be seen. Sonar continues to listen with precision and confidence. The ocean continues to exceed description. Within that excess, motion continues, that never demands translation into signal or meaning. The predator remains there, not as a shadow, not as a threat, not as a secret waiting to be uncovered, but as a quiet consequence of how observation must choose what to keep in order to remain useful at all. In this state, absence acquires permanence. Not permanence as a fact, but as a condition. The system no longer treats the unseen as provisional. It treats it as resolved by omission. Omission is not a gap waiting to be filled. It is an endpoint. Endpoints are comfortable. The predator exists beyond endpoints. It does not generate unfinished loops. It does not leave unresolved states. Every interaction it has with sound resolves cleanly into non-significance. The system closes the file before it is opened. Closure without opening is the most efficient outcome. Efficiency defines success. The predator aligns with success so completely that it becomes indistinguishable from the criteria by which success is measured. It is not merely tolerated, it is structurally protected. Protection is passive. Nothing guards the predator. Nothing needs to. It is sheltered by the architecture of interpretation itself. Interpretation requires compression. Compression removes detail. Removed detail cannot argue for its own return. Once removed, it ceases to exist in any meaningful sense. Meaning is downstream. Downstream processes never encounter the predator. Even when raw data momentarily contains hints, slight inconsistencies, fleeting correlations, marginal distortions, those hints are stripped away before they can influence decision. The system is designed to prevent marginality from contaminating certainty. Certainty is a resource. Resources are conserved. The predator is not worth the cost of uncertainty. Cost-benefit analysis never explicitly includes it. It never appears as a variable. It is excluded before accounting begins. Accounting is where reality is decided. What is not accounted for is not denied. It is ignored. Ignoring is quieter than denial. Quiet processes scale. The predator scales effortlessly across time and space because it never triggers attention. Attention does not scale. It is carefully rationed. Rationing creates shadows. The predator moves within those shadows without friction. It does not accumulate mass in perception. It does not form clusters. It does not show preference that could be tracked. Its path cannot be reconstructed even in principle, because reconstruction would require stored fragments that were never kept. Memory is expensive. The system remembers only what justifies memory. Justification never arises. Thus, the predator does not even qualify as a missing piece. Missing implies expectation. Expectation implies prior knowledge. There is none. The system does not know that it does not know. This is not ignorance. It is resolution. Resolution means deciding that enough is enough. The predator lives beyond enough. In this resolved world, sonar becomes not an instrument of exploration, but of confirmation. It confirms that what matters remains detectable, trackable, and classifiable. It confirms continuity of assumptions. The predator does not interrupt confirmation. Interruption would be noticed. Noticing would matter. The predator never matters. As systems evolve, this relationship hardens further. Automation increases. Human curiosity recedes. Decisions become faster, more decisive, more insulated from raw ambiguity. The window for marginal interpretation narrows to zero. Zero is absolute. The predator fits comfortably within zero. At this point, even philosophical consideration fades. The idea that something could move underwater without appearing on sonar becomes abstract, ungrounded, irrelevant. Without grounding, thought does not persist. Persistence is required even for ideas. The predator denies persistence everywhere. It denies it acoustically. It denies it statistically. It denies it cognitively. Denial without resistance is the most stable form. The ocean continues to support this arrangement effortlessly. It supplies endless variability, endless explanation, endless cover. Sonar selects what it needs and leaves the rest untouched. The predator is untouched, not avoided, not hidden, not protected, simply never engaged. This is not a story of failure, nor of mystery waiting for revelation. It is a story of coexistence between a finite system and an infinite medium. The medium always wins by excess. Within that excess, motion continues, that never asks to be measured, never asks to be known, never asks to be believed. The predator remains there, underwater, within sound, within variability, and permanently beyond the point where appearing would change anything at all. At this stage, even the concept of detection loses sharpness. Detection implies a moment of transition from not known to known, from background to foreground. That moment never occurs. There is no threshold crossing, no sudden clarity. Everything remains distributed, diluted, and therefore stable. Stability replaces curiosity. The system no longer distinguishes between what it could not see and what it chose not to see. Both outcomes converge into the same result: operational silence. Silence is interpreted as success, not as absence. Success is self-referential. The predator exists within that reference loop. It does not interrupt data flows. It does not spike confidence metrics. It does not degrade resolution in a way that propagates upward. Its influence remains local, ephemeral, and immediately absorbed. Absorption is the final filter. Once absorbed, nothing remains to question. The architecture of Sonar assumes that reality will cooperate with sampling. Not fully, not perfectly, but enough. Enough is sufficient. Anything that requires a different notion of cooperation is excluded by default. The predator never cooperates in the required way. It does not align with beams. It does not maintain aspect. It does not repeat geometry. Repetition is the foundation of trust. Trust is the foundation of belief. Belief never forms. In the absence of belief, there is no narrative. Without narrative, events do not accumulate into meaning. They remain isolated impressions, each one resolved independently and then discarded. Discarding is continuous. Continuity is never achieved. The system does not experience this as loss. Loss would require comparison between what was expected and what occurred. Here, expectation has already been narrowed to exclude such motion. Nothing violates expectation. Expectation governs perception more strongly than data. Data that contradicts expectation is filtered as error. Data that fails to contradict expectation is absorbed. The predator ensures it never contradicts. Contradiction would be dangerous. Danger would demand response. The predator remains non-dangerous by remaining non-legible. Legibility is power. Power invites countermeasures. The predator has none because it has no legibility. Even if external observation were to hint at such a presence, integration would fail. Sonar data would not support the claim. Unsupported claims decay quickly. They are absorbed into noise. Noise is infinite. The ocean provides endless noise. It is a perfect reservoir for everything that does not wish to be seen. The predator does not hide in noise. It becomes noise, not chaotic noise, but structured variability that never stabilizes. Enough structure to be real, not enough to be believed. Belief is binary. The predator lives in the continuum belief cannot represent. As automation deepens, this continuum disappears entirely. Only discrete states remain: contact or no contact, track or no track. Everything else is suppressed. Suppression is not concealment. It is normalization. Normalized absence is permanent. There is no path back from it without redesigning the system's philosophy of knowing. Such redesign is unjustifiable without failure. Failure never occurs. The system works. Working systems do not change. The predator does not force change. Thus, the relationship freezes. Sonar continues to define the underwater world as a space of manageable objects and understandable processes. Everything outside that definition is treated as inert background. The predator remains active background. Active background is invisible. Invisible not because it cannot be seen, but because seeing it would serve no purpose. Purpose defines reality. Reality narrows. Within that narrowing, motion continues that never becomes signal, never becomes event, never becomes something that must be remembered. The predator moves there, not waiting, not watching, not preparing, simply persisting as part of a world that exceeds its own representations, underwater, present, moving, and still, never appearing on sonar because appearing was never required. Eventually, the absence becomes operational truth. Truth, in this context, is not correspondence with reality. It is alignment with process. If a phenomenon never enters the decision pipeline, it is treated as if it does not exist. This treatment is not debated. It is implicit. It is encoded. Encoded absence is durable. The predator exists beneath encoding. Encoding reduces the ocean to manageable symbols, distances, bearings, velocities, confidence values. These symbols circulate, combine, and resolve into outputs. Anything that cannot be expressed symbolically is discarded early, before it can contaminate clarity. Clarity is protected aggressively. The predator threatens nothing because it never reaches clarity. It dissolves into pre-symbolic variance, into raw fluctuation that never hardens into form. Form is required for confrontation. Without form, there is nothing to confront. The system does not fear what it cannot name. Fear requires anticipation. Anticipation requires pattern. Pattern requires repetition. The predator repeats only in the sense that it continues to exist, not in the sense that it presents the same evidence twice. Evidence never matches itself. Mismatch prevents accumulation. Accumulation creates pressure. Pressure produces change. Change never comes. Over long periods, the system's internal narrative becomes smoother than the environment it samples. The roughness of reality is sanded away by interpretation. What remains is a functional abstraction, precise, stable, incomplete. Incompleteness is not perceived. Perception is constrained to abstraction. The predator inhabits the discarded roughness. Roughness is infinite underwater. Sound scatters unpredictably. Layers fold and unfold. Small changes propagate into complex interference. The system is forced to treat most of this as background. Without doing so, it would be overwhelmed. Overwhelm is avoided. The predator survives because overwhelm is avoided. It does not need to move deliberately. It does not need to choose paths. It is carried by the same dynamics that force sonar to simplify. It moves with gradients, transitions, instabilities, always where interpretation is least profitable. Profitability guides attention. Unprofitable regions are ignored. Ignored regions become safe corridors. The predator moves through these corridors continuously. No map marks them as such. They emerge from practice, from accumulated confidence about where nothing actionable ever appears. Confidence hardens into neglect. Neglect is stable. Even if raw sensing improves, the same logic applies. Higher resolution produces more data, not more meaning. More data increases the need for filtering. Filtering becomes stricter. The window for marginal phenomena shrinks further. Progress narrows vision. The predator benefits from progress. This creates an illusion of dominance, not by the predator, but by the system. The system appears to command its domain fully. Its outputs are consistent. Its predictions hold. Its silence is reassuring. Reassurance suppresses doubt. Doubt would require anomaly. Anomaly would require persistence. Persistence never occurs. The predator does not mark territory. It does not leave residue. It does not change the baseline enough to be noticed. It exists as transient deviation that resolves before resolution is required. Resolution without effort is ideal. The system resolves everything it notices. The predator is never noticed. Thus, the predator's existence is not a secret waiting to be uncovered. It is a byproduct waiting for nothing. It does not build toward revelation. It does not converge toward discovery. There is no arc. There is only continuation. Sonar continues to listen selectively. The ocean continues to exceed selection. Motion continues to occur outside relevance. Within that motion, something persists that never becomes a target, never becomes a contact, never becomes a question worth asking. It is not hidden in the sense of concealment. It is hidden in the sense of irrelevance. Irrelevance is absolute. As long as relevance governs perception, the predator will remain exactly where it is underwater, within sound, within the limits of interpretation, present, moving, and permanently outside the frame of what must be known. At this point, the system's silence becomes self-reinforcing. Silence no longer signals absence of data. It signals confidence in filtration. The system has learned, implicitly, that what remains after processing is all that needs to be known. Everything else has been judged and dismissed before it could ask to stay. Judgment happens faster than awareness. The predator exists entirely before awareness. It interacts with sound in ways that are real, measurable, physical. Waves bend. Energy redistributes. Phase coherence shifts briefly. These interactions are not imaginary. They are simply insufficient. Insufficiency is terminal. The system does not accumulate insufficient things. Accumulation is reserved for what grows, what insists, what demands reconciliation. The predator never insists. It touches the system lightly and moves on. Light contact leaves no bruise. Without a bruise, there is no memory. Memory is the currency of adaptation. Adaptation never begins. The system's architecture assumes that meaningful entities will tolerate scrutiny. They will remain in view long enough to be measured from multiple angles, long enough to be triangulated, long enough to be reduced to parameters. The predator does not tolerate scrutiny not by resistance, but by absence. Scrutiny arrives after it is already passed. Passing is faster than questioning. This speed is not physical. It is epistemic. Questions lag events. The predator exists in that lag. There is an implicit belief embedded in all sensing systems that what matters will reveal itself repeatedly. That importance correlates with persistence. That threat, if present, will return. The predator violates this belief quietly. It returns without returning. Its presence is continuous in reality, discontinuous in record. Each appearance is isolated. Isolation prevents synthesis. Synthesis is where meaning forms. Meaning never forms. The ocean supports this fragmentation effortlessly. It is large enough, dynamic enough, noisy enough to allow endless non-repeating interactions that still belong to the same underlying cause. Underlying causes do not matter without evidence. Evidence requires coherence. Coherence never stabilizes. The predator does not exploit weakness. It exploits necessity. The necessity to decide quickly. The necessity to reduce complexity. The necessity to trust filters. Trust is mandatory. Without trust, the system would stall. Stalling is worse than ignorance. Thus, the predator is protected by urgency. Urgency shortens attention. Short attention dissolves ambiguity. Ambiguity is the predator's medium. As long as ambiguity is resolved by dismissal rather than investigation, the predator will remain unchallenged, not victorious, not dominant, unnoticed. This unnoticing is not passive. It is active, continuous, systemic. Every cycle confirms that nothing needs to be reconsidered. Every confirmation strengthens the boundary between what is seen and what is allowed to vanish. Boundaries harden. Hard boundaries are impermeable to nuance. The predator is nuance. Nuance does not cross hardened boundaries. Thus, over time, even the idea of unseen motion becomes implausible. Implausibility here does not mean impossible. It means unnecessary to consider. Consideration is optional. Operation is not. The system continues to operate. The ocean continues to move. Within that movement, something persists that never crosses the threshold of consequence, never accumulates into evidence, never becomes something that must be named. It does not hide. It does not wait. It does not announce itself. It simply exists where perception has decided not to linger. Underwater, within sound, within variability. And as long as systems must choose what to care about in order to function at all, that will be enough. At sufficient scale, perception becomes administration. What once was sensing turns into governance of signals. The system no longer encounters the ocean as an unknown. It encounters it as a managed domain, partitioned into probabilities, confidence intervals, acceptable loss. Unknowns are not feared. They are budgeted. The predator exists inside the budget. Budgets absorb uncertainty without comment. They do not ask what fills them. They exist precisely so questions do not have to be asked repeatedly. Once uncertainty is allocated a percentage, its contents become irrelevant. Irrelevance is quantified. The predator fits perfectly within quantification. In this regime, Sonar no longer distinguishes between absence caused by emptiness and absence caused by complexity. Both produce the same operational output. No contact, no track, no action. The cause is secondary. Secondary causes are invisible. This invisibility is not the result of blindness. It is the result of choice repeated until it becomes automatic. The system chooses again and again to prefer stability over exploration, closure over openness, decision over curiosity. Curiosity is fragile. It does not survive scale. At scale, every extra question multiplies cost. Every exception slows throughput. Every unresolved anomaly threatens confidence in outputs that others depend on. The system protects itself by refusing to entertain what cannot be resolved quickly. The predator cannot be resolved quickly. Therefore, it is never entertained. Even when raw signals briefly align in ways that could suggest structure, the system's higher layers are already moving on. Correlation windows close, buffers overwrite, context evaporates. The moment passes without ceremony. Ceremony would imply importance. Importance never attaches. Over time, this creates a smooth surface of certainty across which operations glide effortlessly. The surface is convincing. It reflects success back to itself. Beneath it, complexity continues to churn, unaccounted for. The predator moves beneath the surface, not deeper in physical terms, deeper in interpretive terms. Interpretation has depth. It has layers of abstraction stacked on top of sensation. At the surface, everything is crisp and categorical. Below that, ambiguity increases. Below that, meaning dissolves entirely. The predator never rises above that depth. It does not become categorical. It does not stabilize into ambiguity. It dissolves before either. This dissolution is not disappearance. It is redistribution. Effects spread into the environment until no single point can be identified as source. By the time the system could look back, there is nothing to look at. Looking back is rare. Systems look forward. Forward-looking systems optimize prediction, not reconstruction. Reconstruction is expensive and uncertain. Prediction is cheaper and more useful. The predator does not affect prediction. Therefore, reconstruction is never justified. Without reconstruction, causality fades. Without causality, presence becomes moot. The predator persists as causeless influence. Influence without causality is meaningless. Meaninglessness is stable. This stability extends across upgrades, revisions, generations of technology. Sensors improve. Resolution increases. Processing accelerates. Yet the fundamental constraint remains unchanged. Interpretation must terminate. Termination is non-negotiable. At termination, a decision must be made. Something either matters or it does not. There is no third state that can persist indefinitely. The predator is always assigned the second. This assignment is not error. It is consistency. Consistency is valued above all else. Inconsistent systems are distrusted. Distrust undermines authority. Authority is required for action. Action is the reason the system exists. The predator does not interfere with action. Thus, it remains outside authority. Outside authority, nothing compels recognition. There is no warning that something is being lost. Loss requires contrast between expectation and outcome. Here, expectation has already excluded such phenomena. Expectation filters reality before perception even begins. The predator never passes that filter. It is filtered not because it is weak, but because it is orthogonal to what the filter is designed to admit. Orthogonality is absolute. No amount of intensity compensates for misalignment. Alignment is everything. Sonar aligns with echoes, not with influence. With persistence, not with passage. With repetition, not with flow. The predator is flow. Flow leaves no handles. Without handles, there is nothing to grasp. And so the system glides onward, confident, efficient, silent, where silence is expected. The ocean continues to exceed that silence effortlessly. Within that excess, something continues to move, not accumulating, not escalating, not revealing itself over time. It does not wait for discovery. Discovery is not coming. The predator remains underwater, present in every physical sense, absent in every operational one. It does not need darkness. It does not need secrecy. It does not need speed. It needs only that perception remains finite, purposeful, and satisfied with itself. As long as satisfaction persists, as long as silence is interpreted as success, as long as relevance defines reality, the predator will remain exactly where it has always been. Inside the space between what is sensed and what is allowed to matter. In the end, nothing is revealed. There is no discovery phase waiting beyond the horizon. No future refinement suddenly exposes what was always there. No hidden archive is opened. No threshold is crossed. The system continues exactly as it always has, competent, confident, and complete by its own definition. The predator remains, not as an exception, not as a flaw, but as a consequence. A consequence of finite perception applied to an infinite medium. A consequence of systems that must choose what to care about in order to function at all. A consequence of success measured by stability rather than by completeness. The predator never needed to hide. It never needed to evolve. It never needed to resist. Its existence was guaranteed the moment perception was constrained. Sonar listens for what can be followed. The predator never agrees to be followed. Sonar resolves uncertainty by dismissal. The predator accepts dismissal without consequence. Sonar equates persistence with importance. The predator persists without stabilizing. This asymmetry is permanent. There is no correction available that does not destroy the system's usefulness elsewhere. To see everything would mean understanding nothing. To admit all ambiguity would paralyze action. To treat every absence as suspicious would collapse trust. The predator survives because trust survives. Trust that the environment explains itself. Trust that what matters will insist. Trust that silence means safety. These trusts are not naive. They are necessary. The predator is not a threat because it does not demand response. It does not interfere with outcomes. It does not alter decisions. It does not force reconsideration. It exists alongside operation without friction. Friction would be noticed. Nothing is noticed. The ocean remains vast, layered, dynamic beyond representation. Sound propagates through it imperfectly. Information arrives fractured, delayed, distorted. Sonar samples what it can afford to sample and discards the rest. The discarded remainder is not empty. It never was. Within it, motion continues subtle, continuous, real. Motion that never condenses into a signal worth keeping. Motion that never becomes a question worth asking. Motion that never crosses the boundary from existence into relevance. The predator lives entirely in that remainder, not lurking, not watching, not waiting, simply moving through water and sound in ways that never require acknowledgement. If someday the ocean were emptied of such motion, nothing would change in the system's outputs. That fact alone is the final proof of invisibility. Presence that leaves no absence behind is perfect concealment. The predator does not appear on sonar because sonar does not describe everything that exists. It describes what must be acted upon. Everything else is allowed to pass. And so the system continues to listen, the ocean continues to move, and somewhere within the vast, unaccounted for remainder, something continues its motion perfectly aligned with the limits of knowing. Underwater, present, moving, and finally, conclusively, permanently, never appearing at all.
We upload new videos every single day, so make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss what's next. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, it really helps the channel grow. Tell us in the comments what you'd like to see next. Your ideas might be in our next upload. Thank you so much for watching and for being part of our community. Stay tuned, stay curious, and we'll see you in the next video.